Hey guys, tonight we venture into the greatest military campaign in human history, the Great Crusade, a 200-year odyssey that would see humanity rise from the ashes of terror to master 1,000,000 worlds across the galaxy. The heroic and ultimately tragic tale of the Emperor of Mankind who, against impossible odds, sought to reunite our scattered species under one golden banner. From the smoking ruins of the Unification Wars to the triumphant pinnacle of Ullanor, their story is one of brotherhood, ambition, sacrifice, and the terrible price of perfection. So before we dive into the warp, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in different games lore, do visit my channel Spartan Slumber. I've added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the galaxy's darkest secrets. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the stars together. Picture this. The year is 005.M31. On a desolate moon orbiting the world of Davin, the greatest son of the Emperor lies dying. Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, the most beloved of all the Primarchs, writhes in agony as an ancient blade's poison courses through his superhuman veins. Around his fevered form, his most trusted warriors weep, for they know that if Horus dies, the Great Crusade dies with him. The galaxy's unity, purchased with 2 centuries of blood and sacrifice, hangs by a thread. But in that moment of despair, salvation appears to offer itself. The Lodge Brothers of Davin speak of ancient healing rituals, of powers older than the Imperium itself. They promise life, they promise strength, they promise that Horus can rise again stronger than before. What they do not say is that some cures are worse than death itself, and that in saving the War Master's life, they will damn the galaxy to 10,000 years of endless war. Yet that moment of corruption lies centuries in the future from where our story truly begins. When the 30th millennium was young, and terror still bore the scars of atomic fire, long before the golden age of imperial expansion, the Emperor of Mankind emerged from the shadows of history. His origins remain shrouded in mystery, even to the most learned scholars of the 41st millennium. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of a being who had walked among humanity since the dawn of civilization, watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when our species would need him most. Compared to the grim darkness that would follow, the Emperor arose during an epoch when hope still seemed possible. The galaxy contained perhaps 100 times more human worlds than it does today, scattered like jewels across the spiral arms. These were not the hive cities and forge worlds we know now, but vibrant colonies that had once touched the stars with hands unstained by 10 millennia of war. The cosmic environment differed dramatically from the current hellscape of eternal conflict, for the warp storms that had raged for 5,000 years were finally beginning to calm. The Great Crusade of the late 30th millennium represents the most ambitious attempt to create unity in human history. Unlike the current fragmented state of the Imperium, this era saw a flourishing of cooperation and technological advancement that reflected the Emperor's vision of what humanity could become. Archaeological evidence and fragmentary records place the beginning of this golden age somewhere between the final years of the Unification Wars and the formal declaration of the Crusade in 798.M30. But even in that age of wonders, dark forces were stirring. In the deepest vaults of terror, the Emperor worked feverishly on a project that would dwarf even the reconquest of the galaxy. Ancient texts speak of passages through space itself, of a webway that could free humanity from its dependence on the treacherous currents of the warp. Yet for all his preparation, for all his foresight spanning millennia, the master of mankind could not have foreseen that his greatest victory would plant the seeds of his ultimate defeat. The Thunder Warriors who had served him so faithfully during the Unification Wars were already being quietly replaced, their unstable genetics deemed unsuitable for the greater battles ahead. In their place rose the Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, created from the genetic template of 20 sons who had been scattered across the galaxy by powers that sought to see humanity forever divided. 20 Primarchs, 20 demigod generals who would lead humanity to the stars. Yet even as the first Space Marine legions trained in the halls of terror, their gene fathers remained lost among distant worlds, growing to manhood under alien suns, shaped by cultures and conflicts their creator had never intended them to experience. Some had already begun to show signs of the greatness that would make them legends. On the savage world of Fenris, a pale giant with wild eyes spoke to wolves as brothers and led barbarian tribes against enemies that defied nature itself. On distant Chogoris, a master of the hunt united scattered tribes through speed and cunning, creating an empire built on honor and the thrill of the chase. On grim Medusa, a being more machine than man forged warriors from iron and flesh, teaching them that weakness was death and only strength could preserve humanity's future. But for every tale of heroism and achievement, there were darker stories beginning to unfold. On Colchis, a golden giant knelt before ancient totems, seeking truth in forbidden texts that spoke of powers beyond the material realm. On Nostramo, a creature of living shadow brought order through terror, so complete that crime itself became extinct, yet in doing so created a world where fear was the only law. On a world whose very name has been stricken from imperial records, events were unfolding that would one day force the Emperor to make a choice that would haunt him for eternity. The galaxy of the late 30th millennium was a place of infinite possibility and lurking nightmare. Humanity's children had been scattered for so long that they had begun to evolve along different paths, creating diversity that was both the species' greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. Some worlds had maintained technologies that bordered on the miraculous, while others had fallen so far into barbarism that they worshipped the very machines their ancestors had built. And in the space between the stars, in the realm of souls and dreams that humanity had learned to navigate but never truly understand, ancient intelligences were beginning to take notice of the growing psychic beacon that was our species. They had waited patiently through the age of strife, content to let humanity tear itself apart in isolation. But now, as the warp storms calmed and interstellar travel became possible once more, they began to suspect that their long game of corruption and manipulation was entering its final phase. The stage was set for the greatest drama in galactic history. On one side stood the Emperor of mankind, the culmination of human evolution and ambition, preparing to launch a crusade that would see 1,000,000 worlds brought under the aegis of a single government. On the other waited forces older than human civilization, powers that had learned patience in the spaces between heartbeats and viewed the rise and fall of species as mere entertainment. Between them lay the Primarchs, 20 genetic masterpieces scattered across the galaxy, like pieces on a vast game board, each growing in strength and character, unaware that they were destined to be the focal points around which the fate of humanity would turn. Some would become legends of heroism whose deeds would inspire warriors for 10,000 years. Others would fall so far into darkness that their very names would become curses spoken only in whispers. But in those final years before the Great Crusade's formal beginning, none of this was yet determined. The future remained unwritten, a blank scroll waiting for the first words of what would become either humanity's greatest triumph or its most catastrophic failure. The Emperor stood ready to take the first steps toward galactic dominion, his armies trained, his fleets prepared, his vision clear and bright as a star. Yet even then, if legends speak truly, there were moments when the master of mankind would pause in his preparations and gaze toward the distant stars with an expression that might have been sorrow. For perhaps, in his ancient wisdom and supernatural foresight, he had already glimpsed the shadow of what was to come. To understand the magnitude of what the Emperor sought to achieve, one must first comprehend the state of the galaxy in the final centuries of the 30th millennium. For more than 5,000 years, humanity had been trapped in what scholars now call the Age of Strife, an era of isolation so complete that entire stellar regions had lost all contact with their neighbors. The warp storms that had made interstellar travel impossible were finally beginning to calm, like a great ocean settling after a hurricane that had raged for millennia. In those dark years, human civilization had not merely stagnated, it had actively regressed. Worlds that had once been connected by trade routes, spanning thousands of light years, were reduced to isolated islands in an ocean of stars. Cut off from the technological and cultural exchange that had sustained the dark age of technology, each colony was forced to survive or perish, based solely on its own resources and ingenuity. The results were as varied as they were tragic. On some worlds, the descendants of the original colonists had managed to maintain their technological heritage, becoming fortress worlds where ancient machines still functioned and knowledge was preserved in crystalline data cores. These became the night worlds, where noble houses piloted god machines passed down through generations, or the early Forge worlds, where the cult of the machine had taken root among populations desperate to keep their technology functioning. Other worlds had not been so fortunate. Robbed of the infrastructure that had once sustained billions, these colonies collapsed into barbarism. Their populations, once numbering in the hundreds of millions, dwindled to scattered tribes who viewed the ruins of their ancestors' achievements as holy sites or cursed places to be avoided. Many had forgotten that they had ever traveled between the stars, coming to believe that their world was the entirety of creation, and that the lights in the night sky were distant campfires of the gods. Perhaps most tragically, some worlds had thrived in isolation, developing unique cultures and technologies that represented genuine human achievement, only to have their independence viewed as defiance when the Great Crusade finally reached them. These worlds would face a choice that no human government should have to make: to surrender their hard-won autonomy or face annihilation at the hands of their own species. The Xenos' powers had not been idle during humanity's time of weakness. Orc empires had expanded into what had once been human space, turning paradise worlds into battle-scarred wastelands where endless wars raged for no purpose beyond the joy of violence. The Eldar, still reeling from the catastrophic birth of Slaanesh that had consumed the heart of their empire, watched from their craft worlds as younger races struggled for dominance among the ruins of the galaxy. Other species, whose names have been forgotten or deliberately expunged from imperial records, had carved out their own domains in the darkness. Some were peaceful, content to develop their own worlds without expanding beyond their home systems. Others were predatory, viewing the scattered human colonies as hunting grounds where they could raid for slaves, resources, or simple entertainment. All would eventually face the choice between submission and extinction when humanity's fleets finally darkened their skies. Yet for all the diversity of threats and challenges that awaited the Great Crusade, perhaps the greatest enemy was time itself. Every year that passed saw more knowledge lost, more technology failing, more human worlds slipping further from the civilization they had once known. Entire star systems were going dark as their populations fell below the levels needed to maintain even basic infrastructure. The window of opportunity for reunification was closing, and the Emperor knew that if he waited much longer, there might be nothing left of humanity worth saving. On Terra itself, the picture was simultaneously more hopeful and more complex. The unification wars had finally ended after centuries of conflict, but the scars they left ran deeper than mere physical damage. The Emperor had been forced to destroy wonders to achieve unity, to sacrifice irreplaceable artifacts of the dark age of technology in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of his enemies. The techno-barbarian warlords who had ruled Terra's fractured nations were gone, but so too were many of the technological marvels they had hoarded. The Thunder Warriors who had won the Emperor's victories were themselves a symbol of the price of unification. These superhuman soldiers had been created for a specific purpose, to overcome enemies that normal human armies could not face. But their genetic instability meant they were never intended to survive long past their usefulness. Even as they stood victorious on the battlefields of Terra, their creator was already working to replace them with something more suitable for the greater war to come. The first Space Marine legions were being forged in the genetic laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks, their gene seed drawn from the 20 scattered Primarchs. Yet without their gene fathers to lead them, these early Astartes lacked the full potential that would make them legends. They were magnificent warriors, superior to any human soldier who had ever lived, but they were incomplete, like symphonies missing their crescendo or paintings lacking their final brushstrokes. Mars had already been brought into the Emperor's Grand Alliance, its fabricator general kneeling before the Master of Mankind in recognition of his fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The Forge world's vast manufacturing capacity was being turned toward a single purpose, the creation of fleets and armies on a scale that had not been seen since the Dark Age of technology. In the orbital shipyards above the Red Planet, vessels were taking shape that would carry the Emperor's banner to every corner of the galaxy. The early recruitment drives had begun across Terra and Luna, drawing volunteers from populations still rebuilding from the devastation of the unification wars. These men and women would form the core of the Imperial Army, the countless millions of soldiers who would provide the backbone of the Great Crusade's conventional forces. They came from every nation and culture that Terra had ever known, united for the first time in their planet's history under a single cause and a single leader. Yet even in those hopeful days, there were signs of the challenges to come. The Emperor's vision of unity was absolute, requiring not just political submission, but cultural and intellectual conformity. The imperial truth, his doctrine of rational materialism, demanded the abandonment of all religious belief and superstition. For many of Terra's newly conquered populations, this represented not liberation, but spiritual annihilation. The logistics of the coming campaign were staggering beyond comprehension. To supply even a single expeditionary fleet required the resources of entire worlds. Food, ammunition, fuel, replacement equipment, medical supplies, personnel, all had to be produced, transported, and distributed across distances so vast that communication delays could measure in years. The creation of supply chains capable of supporting a galactic campaign would require innovations in organization and administration that had never been attempted in human history. Intelligence gathering was another monumental challenge. The galaxy contained millions of star systems, any one of which might harbor threats or treasures that could alter the course of the entire campaign. Without reliable, faster-than-light communication, each expeditionary fleet would be operating independently for months or years at a time, making decisions that could affect the fate of billions based on information that might be decades out of date. The human element was perhaps the most complex challenge of all. The populations that the Great Crusade would encounter had been shaped by 5,000 years of isolation into forms that the Emperor's planners could never have anticipated. Some would welcome reunification with joy and relief. Others would fight to preserve independence they had paid for with blood and sacrifice. Still others would view the approaching imperial fleets not as liberators, but as just another Xenos threat to be repelled. Cultural integration would prove to be an ongoing source of friction throughout the Great Crusade. Worlds that had developed their own languages, customs, and social structures were expected to abandon their heritage in favor of imperial standardization. The process of compliance was intended to be more than mere military conquest. It was designed to transform entire civilizations, remaking them in the image of the Emperor's vision for humanity. Training programs were being established to prepare not just for military conquest, but for the administration of a galactic empire. The bureaucrats and administrators who would govern newly compliant worlds needed to understand not just imperial law and policy, but also the psychology of populations emerging from millennia of isolation. They would be expected to transform barbaric tribes into productive imperial citizens, to integrate advanced technological civilizations into the imperial economy, and to root out any trace of Xenos influence or corruption that might threaten the spiritual purity of humanity. The scale of the undertaking was matched only by its ambition. The Emperor was not merely seeking to conquer the galaxy. He was attempting to transform it into something that had never existed before. A unified human civilization spanning millions of worlds, bound together by shared purpose and rational thought. It was a dream worthy of a god, and perhaps only a being with the power of a god could have believed it possible. But even as the final preparations were being made, as the great fleets gathered in the outer reaches of the Sol system, and the first expeditionary commanders received their sealed orders, there were those who wondered whether such unity was truly possible. The diversity of human civilization had been one of its greatest strengths during the dark age of technology, allowing for innovations and adaptations that no single world could have achieved alone. Some whispered that the Emperor's vision, for all its nobility, might require the sacrifice of the very qualities that made humanity worth saving. Others argued that the challenges ahead were so vast and terrible that only absolute unity could ensure the species' survival. These debates would continue throughout the Great Crusade, growing more intense with each passing year, until they would eventually tear apart the very thing they sought to preserve. As the final months before the Great Crusade's launch ticked away, the Emperor himself withdrew increasingly into the deepest vaults of terror, working on projects that even his closest advisors were not permitted to witness. Some claimed he was perfecting the technologies that would make interstellar governance possible. Others suggested he was preparing defenses against threats that had not yet revealed themselves. A few, speaking only in the most secure locations, wondered whether he was having doubts about the wisdom of the path he had chosen. Whatever the truth, the die was cast. The greatest military campaign in human history was about to begin, and with it would come changes that would reshape not just humanity, but the galaxy itself. The age of isolation was ending, and what would follow would test the very limits of what mortal beings could achieve. The formal declaration came on a day that would reshape the galaxy forever. In the year 798 of the 30th millennium, as Terra's rebuilt cities gleamed under an artificial sun, and the orbital shipyards of Mars hummed with unprecedented activity, the Emperor of Mankind stepped before the assembled representatives of his new imperium and spoke words that would echo through 10,000 years of history. The Great Crusade had begun, but unlike the grand pronouncements of lesser conquerors throughout history, this was not mere political theater. Even as the Emperor's voice carried across Terra's communications networks, the first expeditionary fleets were already powering up their warp drives in the outer reaches of the Sol system. Months of careful preparation had led to this moment, and within hours of the official declaration, humanity's children would once again reach out toward distant stars. The initial target selection revealed the methodical brilliance behind the Emperor's strategy. Rather than striking out randomly into the galactic void, the early expeditionary fleets were directed towards systems where ancient records suggested human populations might still survive. Some of these targets were based on fragmentary data recovered from the dark age of technology archives. Others came from the testimonies of the few surviving navigators whose houses had maintained sketchy records of pre-strife trade routes. Each expeditionary fleet represented a carefully balanced instrument of conquest and integration. At their core were the Space Marine legions, still incomplete without their scattered Primarchs, but nonetheless the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. These genetically enhanced super soldiers were supported by vast formations of the Imperial Army, regular human troops drawn from Terra's rebuilt nations and equipped with the finest weapons the forgers of Mars could produce. But the fleets carried more than just military might. Each expedition included administrators, engineers, tech priests, remembrances to record their achievements, and most importantly, the infrastructure necessary to transform conquest into lasting integration. Supply ships, construction vessels, communication arrays, industrial equipment, all the mundane but essential tools needed to bind newly discovered worlds into the growing web of imperial civilization. The early missions followed a pattern that would become familiar throughout the Crusade. Upon entering a system, the expeditionary fleet would conduct detailed surveys, identifying any human populations and assessing their technological and military capabilities. First contact protocols emphasized negotiation and demonstration rather than immediate conquest. Many worlds isolated for millennia were overwhelmed by the mere sight of imperial vessels emerging from the warp. Those early encounters varied wildly in their outcomes. Some human populations, particularly those that had managed to preserve records of their origins, welcomed the imperial fleets as long-awaited saviors. These worlds had maintained oral traditions or written chronicles that spoke of Terra as the ancestral home of humanity, and their populations saw reunification as a return to their rightful place in a greater civilization. The world of Proxima Centauri became one of the first great success stories of the early Crusade. Its population had not only survived the Age of Strife, but had actually prospered, developing advanced biotechnology that complemented rather than replaced the mechanical sciences favored by Mars. Their integration into the imperial fold was so smooth that within a decade, Proxima Centauri had become a major recruitment center and supply hub for further expansion. Other worlds proved more challenging. Populations that had fought desperately for survival during the Dark Years, understandably suspicious of any external authority, even one claiming to represent their own species. These worlds had developed fierce independence born from necessity, and their leaders were reluctant to surrender the autonomy that had kept their people alive through the worst catastrophe in human history. Negotiations with these resistant populations required a delicate balance of persuasion and demonstration. Imperial commanders would typically begin by offering technological aid and protection from Xenos threats, using their vastly superior capabilities to solve problems that had plagued isolated worlds for generations. The sight of Imperial forces effortlessly defeating Orc raiding parties or repairing critical infrastructure that had been failing for centuries often proved more persuasive than any diplomatic argument. Yet even these peaceful integrations came with a cost. The imperial truth demanded the abandonment of local religious beliefs, many of which had provided spiritual comfort during the darkest years of isolation. Traditional power structures were replaced with imperial administrative systems. Local cultures were gradually subsumed into the homogenizing influence of imperial civilization. For all the material benefits that compliance brought, there was always a sense of something lost, a uniqueness that could never be recovered. The early expeditionary fleets also encountered their first taste of the Xenos threats that would plague the entire Crusade. Orc Empire expansions had claimed many systems that once belonged to humanity, and these green-skinned savages showed no interest in negotiation or coexistence. The Imperial forces' first major Xenos engagement occurred in the Genna system, where an Orc war boss had established a crude empire spanning 3 worlds. The Battle of Genna became a proving ground for Imperial tactics and doctrine. The Space Marines demonstrated their superiority in direct combat, their enhanced physiology and superior equipment allowing them to carve through Orc formations that would have overwhelmed conventional human forces. But it was the coordination between different Imperial units that truly impressed observers. Space Marines provided the spearhead, Imperial army formations secured objectives and held ground, while the Imperial Navy maintained orbital superiority and provided fire support. The victory at Genna sent shockwaves through the local region. Other Xenos powers took notice of humanity's return to galactic prominence, and their reactions varied from attempts at negotiation to immediate preparation for war. The Eldar, still recovering from their own recent catastrophe, watched these early Imperial victories with growing concern. Their Farseer councils could see potential futures where humanity's expansion threatened not just their own recovery, but the stability of the galaxy itself. Meanwhile, species that had grown accustomed to preying on isolated human colonies suddenly found themselves facing organized resistance for the first time in millennia. Raiders who had operated with impunity against defenseless worlds now encountered Imperial patrol fleets equipped with technology and tactics that far exceeded anything they had previously faced. Many of these predatory species retreated deeper into unexplored regions of the galaxy, while others began forming alliances to resist the growing Imperial presence. The success of these early missions began to generate momentum that would sustain the Great Crusade for the next 2 centuries. Each victory brought new resources, new recruitment opportunities, and new forward bases for further expansion. Newly compliant worlds contributed their populations to the Imperial army and their industrial capacity to the war effort. Forge worlds provided manufacturing capability, while agricultural worlds ensured that the growing fleets remained supplied with food and other necessities. Perhaps most importantly, these early successes began to vindicate the Emperor's vision in the eyes of his followers. The Space Marine legions, initially skeptical about their ability to operate without their Primarch gene fathers, gained confidence with each engagement. Imperial Army commanders developed tactics and strategies specifically designed for the unique challenges of galactic conquest. The administrative apparatus learned to process and integrate diverse human populations with increasing efficiency. The communication networks that linked these scattered victories began to create something unprecedented in human history: a true galactic civilization. Messages that might have taken decades to travel during the Age of Strife could now be transmitted across vast distances through a combination of astropathic communication and courier ships. Trade routes reopened for the first time in millennia, allowing for the exchange of resources and ideas between worlds that had been isolated since before recorded history. Yet even in these early days of triumph, careful observers might have noticed the seeds of future problems beginning to sprout. The rapid pace of expansion was stretching Imperial resources and administrative capabilities to their limits. Each new world brought unique challenges that required innovative solutions, but the pressure to maintain momentum meant that these solutions were often improvised rather than carefully planned. Different expeditionary fleets began to develop their own approaches to conquest and compliance, influenced by the personalities of their commanders and the specific challenges they faced. Some favored aggressive tactics that prioritized speed over diplomatic niceties. Others took a more cautious approach, investing time in understanding local cultures before attempting integration. These variations in approach would later create inconsistencies in Imperial policy that enemies could exploit. The absence of the Primarchs was also becoming increasingly apparent as the Crusade expanded. While the Space Marine legions performed admirably under their appointed commanders, there was a sense of incompleteness that affected both morale and effectiveness. The gene seed of each legion carried the potential for greatness, but without their Primarch gene fathers to unlock that potential, the Astartes remained magnificent, but somehow limited. Reports began to filter back to terror of anomalous phenomena encountered during warp travel. Strange dreams experienced by navigator houses, unexplained equipment malfunctions, brief encounters with entities that defied rational explanation. These incidents were initially dismissed as the inevitable result of humanity's return to large-scale warp travel after millennia of isolation. The dangers of the Immaterium were well known, and the early Crusade planners had expected to encounter such problems as their fleets pushed deeper into unexplored regions. But some of the more experienced navigators, particularly those from houses that had maintained continuous operation throughout the Age of Strife, began to report patterns in these incidents that suggested something more troubling. The phenomena seemed to be most common in certain regions of the galaxy, areas where ancient star charts marked the locations of civilizations that had vanished during the collapse of the Dark Age of technology. These navigators spoke in whispers of sensing vast intelligences, moving in the deep currents of the warp, ancient minds that had taken notice of humanity's return to galactic prominence. The Emperor himself remained largely aloof from day-to-day command decisions during this period, delegating operational authority to his most trusted commanders while he focused on longer-term strategic planning. His rare appearances at war councils were marked by an intensity and focus that suggested he was aware of challenges and opportunities that remained invisible to his subordinates. When questioned about his concerns, he would often speak cryptically about the need to move quickly to achieve their objectives before windows of opportunity closed forever. As the first phase of the Great Crusade reached its end, the Imperium had already grown beyond anything that had existed in human history. Hundreds of worlds had been brought into compliance, billions of new citizens had been integrated into imperial civilization, and the foundation had been laid for expansion on a truly galactic scale. The early expeditionary fleets had proven that the Emperor's vision was not merely a dream, but an achievable reality. Yet even as celebration filled the halls of terror and the forged temples of Mars rang with hymns of triumph, the true test of the Great Crusade lay ahead. The easy victories of the initial expansion had been won against isolated worlds and minor Xenos powers. The greater challenges, the ancient empires and sleeping threats that had ruled the galaxy during humanity's absence, were only beginning to take notice of the new power rising from the Sol system. The stage was set for conflicts that would test not just the military might of the Imperium, but the very foundations of the civilization the Emperor sought to create. The galaxy trembled when the first Primarch was found, not from any seismic disturbance or cosmic phenomenon, but from the sudden shift in the balance of power that accompanied the reunion of a gene-father with his scattered sons. The discovery, integration, and deployment of these demigod generals transformed the Great Crusade from a methodical expansion into something approaching inevitable conquest. Historical records from this period, though fragmentary, suggest that the early Primarch recoveries occurred within the first few decades of the Crusade. Each discovery followed a similar pattern that would become familiar to Imperial forces. Ancient fragments of data, psychic visions, or navigator reports would point toward a particular system where strange phenomena had been detected. Upon investigation, Imperial scouts would find not just human populations, but communities led by beings whose capabilities defied conventional understanding. The first encounters between the Emperor and his recovered sons were moments of profound transformation for everyone involved. The Primarchs themselves, many of whom had grown to adulthood believing they were unique aberrations, or perhaps divine beings, suddenly found themselves face to face with their creator. The emotional impact of these reunions cannot be overstated. Beings who had conquered worlds and led civilizations with absolute confidence found themselves reduced to overwhelmed children in the presence of a father they had never known but always longed for. For the Space Marine legions, the arrival of their Gene Father was nothing short of revolutionary. Warriors who had already proven themselves among the finest soldiers in human history discovered that they had been operating at a fraction of their potential. The presence of their Primarch unlocked capabilities they never knew they possessed, enhanced their existing abilities, and provided them with a tactical and strategic leadership that elevated their entire mode of warfare. Take the transformation of the Lunar Wolves upon their reunion with Horus Heresy. The Legion had already distinguished itself during the early phases of the Crusade, earning a reputation for aggressive assault tactics and unwavering loyalty to the imperial cause. But under Horus, they evolved into something unprecedented. Their battlefield coordination reached levels that approached telepathic communication. Their strategic thinking expanded from simple conquest to complex multi-system operations. Most importantly, their morale and esprit de corps became legendary throughout the imperial forces. Horus himself embodied everything the Emperor had hoped to achieve in his sons: charismatic beyond measure, strategically brilliant, and possessed of a diplomatic skill that could turn enemies into allies. With nothing more than words, he represented the perfect synthesis of warrior and statesman. His ability to understand and motivate not just his own legion, but all imperial forces made him invaluable as the Crusade expanded into regions where multiple expeditionary fleets needed to coordinate their operations. The discovery of Leman Russ on Fenris revealed different but equally impressive capabilities. Where Horus excelled at grand strategy and coalition building, Russ demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of warfare at its most primal level. His integration with the Space Wolves transformed that legion into something that walked the line between civilized military force and unleashed natural disaster. Under Russ, the Wolves became the Emperor's executioners, the force deployed when conventional military action was insufficient and extreme measures were required. Fenris itself became a case study in how Primarch integration could transform not just military units, but entire worlds. Under Russ's leadership, the planet's feudal tribal structure was gradually modified to serve imperial needs while maintaining the cultural elements that made Fenrisian warriors so effective. The result was a recruitment and training system that produced Space Marines uniquely suited to operations in the galaxy's most dangerous and unpredictable regions. Each subsequent Primarch discovery brought its own unique advantages and challenges. Robert Guilliman's reunion with the Ultramarines introduced organizational and administrative innovations that became standard throughout the Imperial forces. His Codex principles, though not yet formalized, began to influence how other legions approached everything from logistics to combat doctrine. The Ultramarines' home region of Ultramar became a model for how Imperial integration could create prosperity and stability that exceeded even pre-strife standards. Ferrus Manius and the Iron Hands brought technological capabilities that complemented but often exceeded those of the Mechanicum. The Primarch's unique relationship with machinery, his ability to enhance and modify technology through methods that even the tech priests couldn't fully understand, provided Imperial forces with equipment advantages that proved decisive in numerous campaigns. More importantly, the Iron Hand's philosophy of constant improvement and adaptation helped develop the tactical flexibility that would become essential as the Crusade encountered increasingly diverse and challenging opponents. The psychological impact of these reunions extended far beyond the immediate military benefits. For the first time since the Great Crusade began, Imperial forces could see tangible proof that the Emperor's vision was not just achievable, but divinely ordained. The very existence of the Primarchs, beings who had been scattered across the galaxy as infants, and yet had inevitably risen to positions of leadership and power, seemed to validate the idea that humanity was destined for greatness among the stars. This growing confidence manifested itself in increasingly ambitious military operations, where early Crusade forces had approached unknown systems with careful reconnaissance and cautious engagement protocols. Expeditionary fleets now began launching bold, multi-vector assaults against heavily defended Xenos strongholds. The presence of Primarch leadership gave Imperial commanders the confidence to attempt operations that would have been considered impossible just decades earlier. The Battle of Gyrus Thravian became the first major demonstration of what Imperial forces could achieve when multiple Primarchs coordinated their efforts. The system contained one of the largest Orc empires yet encountered, with defensive installations that had been built up over centuries of warfare. Previous Imperial doctrine would have called for a lengthy siege, followed by systematic reduction of enemy strongpoints. Instead, the combined forces of 3 different legions, each led by their respective Primarchs, executed a campaign that lasted less than a month and resulted in the complete extermination of Orc presence throughout the system. But perhaps more impressive than the military victory was what came after. The rapid pacification and integration of Gyrus Thravian's human populations demonstrated that Imperial forces had developed the capability to not just conquer, but to rebuild. Within a year of the system's liberation, industrial production was exceeding pre-war levels. Within 5 years, Gyrus Thravian had become a significant contributor to the Crusade's logistical network. The transformation from war zone to productive Imperial territory became a template that would be repeated thousands of times across the galaxy. The success of these operations began to generate a momentum that seemed to feed on itself. Each victory brought new resources, new allies, and new opportunities for expansion. Word of Imperial achievements spread through both official channels and informal networks, creating a reputation that often preceded the arrival of expeditionary fleets. Some worlds actively sought out Imperial contact, hoping to join the growing empire before they were conquered by its enemies. But the Primarchs brought more than just military capability to the Crusade. Each possessed a unique perspective, shaped by their experiences growing up on distant worlds, often under conditions of extreme adversity. These perspectives enriched Imperial strategic thinking by introducing approaches and solutions that would never have occurred to purely Terran-educated commanders. Lionel Johnson's mastery of forest warfare, developed during his youth fighting the chaos beasts of Caliban, provided Imperial forces with tactics perfectly suited for operations on feral worlds where conventional military doctrine was inadequate. Jagatai Khan's understanding of mobility and rapid deployment, learned during his conquest of Chorgoris, revolutionized imperial approaches to system-wide campaigns where speed could compensate for numerical disadvantages. Perhaps most significantly, the Primarchs served as bridges between the Emperor's grand vision and the practical realities of galactic conquest. Where the master of mankind sometimes seemed remote and incomprehensible to ordinary imperial personnel, the Primarchs were accessible leaders who could translate cosmic objectives into achievable mission parameters. Their ability to inspire not just their own legions, but entire expeditionary fleets became one of the Crusade's most valuable strategic assets. Yet even as the Primarchs transformed imperial capabilities, careful observers began to notice subtle variations in how different Gene Fathers approached their duties. Some, like Guilliman and Dawn, focused on building lasting institutions that could function effectively even in their absence. Others, like Russ and Angren, preferred direct personal leadership that maximized immediate combat effectiveness, but created potential problems if that leadership was removed. These differences in approach reflected the diverse experiences that had shaped each Primarch during their formative years. While all had risen to positions of leadership on their respective worlds, the methods by which they had achieved and maintained power varied dramatically. Some had united their planets through diplomacy and inspiration. Others had conquered them through superior force and intimidation. Each approach had its advantages, but they also created potential friction points when multiple Primarchs needed to coordinate their operations. The integration of Primarch capabilities with existing imperial doctrine required constant adaptation and innovation. Military hierarchies that had been designed for conventional human commanders needed to accommodate beings whose capabilities exceeded normal parameters by orders of magnitude. Communication protocols developed for standard expeditionary fleets required modification when dealing with forces that could process information and make decisions at superhuman speeds. Supply and logistics systems faced similar challenges. Primarch-led operations often moved faster and struck harder than conventional forces, creating supply demands that exceeded traditional planning parameters. The rapid pace of Primarch-led conquests often outpaced the administrative systems designed to integrate newly compliant worlds, creating backlogs and inefficiencies that would later prove problematic. Despite these growing pains, the overall impact of Primarch integration on the Great Crusade was overwhelmingly positive. Conquest rates increased exponentially. Enemy resistance that had once required months of careful planning could now be overcome in days or weeks. Most importantly, the morale and confidence of Imperial forces reached heights that made them virtually unstoppable in conventional military engagements. As the early phase of Primarch integration reached completion, the Great Crusade stood poised to enter its golden age. The combination of Imperial industrial capacity, space marine capabilities, and Primarch leadership had created a military force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The scattered human populations that had survived the Age of Strife were being rapidly integrated into a unified civilization that promised to exceed even the achievements of the Dark Age of technology. Yet even in this moment of triumph, there were signs that the very success of the Crusade was beginning to create new categories of challenges. The rapid pace of expansion was stretching communication and administrative systems to their breaking points. The diverse approaches favored by different Primarchs were creating inconsistencies in imperial policy and doctrine. Most ominously, the growing confidence and independence of the Gene Fathers was beginning to create subtle tensions within the imperial command structure that would in time prove catastrophic for everything they had worked to achieve. There comes a moment in every great undertaking when all the pieces fall into perfect alignment, when years of preparation and struggle crystallize into something that approaches the ideal. For the Great Crusade, that moment arrived in the middle decades of the 30th millennium, when the combination of recovered Primarchs, refined doctrine, and accumulated experience created a war machine of unprecedented efficiency and capability. The numbers alone tell part of the story. Imperial compliance rates reached levels that would never again be matched in the Crusade's remaining years. Entire sectors were being integrated into the growing empire in timeframes that had once been required to conquer single systems. The expeditionary fleet system, refined through decades of experience, had become a precision instrument capable of tailoring its approach to any conceivable challenge. Most remarkably, this expansion was being achieved not through brute force alone, but through a sophisticated combination of military might, diplomatic skill, and administrative excellence that left newly compliant worlds better off than they had been before imperial contact. The organizational structure that emerged during this period represented perhaps humanity's greatest administrative achievement. The War Council, comprising the Emperor, his most trusted Primarchs, and senior imperial commanders, had evolved into a decision-making body capable of coordinating operations across galactic distances, while maintaining the flexibility needed to respond to unexpected challenges. Regular councils brought together military leaders, administrators, tech priests, and remembrancers to share information, coordinate strategies, and resolve the countless logistical and political issues that arose from governing an empire spanning millions of worlds. Each expeditionary fleet had become a self-contained instrument of imperial will, capable of independent operation for years at a time, while remaining integrated into the larger strategic framework. The standardization of equipment, doctrine, and administrative procedures meant that fleets could be combined or subdivided as needed without loss of effectiveness. Supply chains that had once been haphazard and unreliable had evolved into sophisticated networks capable of supporting operations at the very edge of known space. But it was the Primarchs themselves who truly elevated the Crusade during this period. By now, most of the Gene Fathers had been recovered and integrated into imperial operations. Each brought unique capabilities and perspectives that enhanced the overall effectiveness of the war effort. More importantly, they had learned to work together, combining their individual strengths into collaborative efforts that achieved results none could have accomplished alone. The synergy between different legion specializations became one of the Crusade's most powerful assets. The Imperial Fist's mastery of siege warfare could be combined with the White Scar's mobility to reduce enemy strongholds that had once seemed impregnable. The Iron Warrior's expertise in fortification could be paired with the Blood Angel's assault capabilities to create defensive positions that were simultaneously impenetrable and capable of launching devastating counterattacks. The Word-Bearer's skill at cultural integration could smooth the path for the World Eater's more direct approaches to compliance. Technological recovery during this period exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The network of Forge worlds had expanded far beyond Mars, with newly discovered or established manufacturing centers, contributing innovations that pushed imperial capabilities to unprecedented levels. STC system discoveries were accelerating the restoration of technologies that had been lost during the Age of Strife. More importantly, the combination of Mechanicum expertise with Primarch insights was driving genuine innovation for the first time in millennia. The weapons and equipment available to Imperial forces during this period were arguably superior to anything that had existed during the Dark Age of technology. Space Marine power armor had been refined to provide protection and capability enhancement that turned already superhuman warriors into nearly unstoppable instruments of war. Imperial Guard equipment, while less advanced than Astartes gear, was nonetheless decades ahead of anything used by human forces during the Unification Wars. Starship design had similarly evolved, incorporating both recovered archaeotech and new innovations inspired by the unique requirements of galactic conquest. Imperial vessels of this era combined firepower, protection, and reliability in ways that made them dominant in any engagement. The massive battle barges that carried Space Marine strike forces could serve simultaneously as troop transports, orbital bombardment platforms, and command centers for multi-system operations. Communications technology represented perhaps the most critical improvement. The combination of astropathic networks, improved Vox systems, and courier ship protocols had created the first truly galactic communication system in human history. Messages that would have taken decades to transmit during the Age of Strife could now cross vast distances in months or weeks. This breakthrough made possible the level of coordination required to conduct simultaneous operations across multiple sectors while maintaining strategic coherence. Economic integration was producing benefits that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Trade networks that had been severed for millennia were being rapidly re-established, allowing worlds to specialize in areas where they held natural advantages while relying on imperial commerce to meet other needs. Agricultural worlds could focus on food production, knowing that manufactured goods would be available through imperial trade. Industrial worlds could maximize their output without concern for local resource limitations. The human element of this success cannot be understated. Imperial forces during this period were not just well-equipped and well-trained, they were motivated by a sense of purpose and destiny that made them nearly unstoppable. The visible evidence of the Emperor's vision becoming reality inspired a level of dedication and sacrifice that transcended normal military discipline. Soldiers who might have been reluctant conscripts in earlier eras volunteered eagerly for assignments that they knew might keep them away from home for decades. Space Marines of this era represented the absolute pinnacle of what the Astartes could achieve. Led by their Primarch gene fathers, supported by the finest equipment human technology could produce, and motivated by unshakable faith in their cause, they were quite literally the finest warriors the galaxy had ever seen. Their battlefield achievements during this period became the stuff of legend, inspiring countless generations of future Space Marines, while striking terror into the hearts of humanity's enemies. Yet it was not just military prowess that distinguished this golden age. Imperial forces had learned to be builders as well as conquerors. Newly compliant worlds were not simply strip-mined for resources and left to decay. Instead, they were integrated into the growing imperial economy in ways that improved living standards while contributing to the overall war effort. Infrastructure projects connected isolated communities, educational programs spread literacy and technical knowledge, and medical advances eliminated diseases that had plagued human populations for millennia. The scope of these achievements is difficult to comprehend from our perspective 10,000 years later. Entire stellar regions that had been isolated since the collapse of the Dark Age of technology were being transformed into thriving centers of human civilization within decades of first imperial contact. The rate of change was so rapid that populations who had grown up as feudal peasants on backwater worlds could find themselves citizens of a galactic empire with access to technologies that seemed miraculous. Archaeological projects during this period were uncovering treasures of knowledge that had been lost for millennia. Ancient libraries, hidden data vaults, and preserved STC systems were providing insights into human history and capability that transformed understanding of what the species could achieve. The Great Crusade was not just reuniting scattered human populations, it was literally rebuilding human civilization from the ground up. The diversity of human experience that the Crusade encountered during this period was both a challenge and a tremendous asset. Worlds that had developed unique solutions to common problems provided innovations that could be applied across the growing empire. Agricultural techniques developed on one world could revolutionize food production on dozens of others. Military tactics that had evolved in response to specific Xenos threats could be adapted for use against similar enemies throughout the galaxy. This cultural and technological exchange created a renaissance of human achievement that rivaled anything from the Dark Age of technology. But more than that, it created a sense of shared human identity that transcended the regional variations that had developed during the Age of Strife. For the first time in millennia, humans across the galaxy could see themselves as part of a single species with a common destiny among the stars. The relationship between the Emperor and his Primarch sons during this period represented a unique moment in galactic history. Never before had beings of such capability worked together toward a common goal with such effectiveness. The Gene Fathers had grown into their roles as military leaders and administrators, while still maintaining the filial bonds that tied them to their creator. The Emperor, for his part, had learned to delegate operational authority while maintaining strategic oversight, creating a command structure that combined unified vision with tactical flexibility. But perhaps most remarkably, this golden age was built not on the suppression of human diversity, but on its celebration and integration. The imperial philosophy of this era emphasized that humanity's greatest strength lay in its adaptability, its ability to thrive under any conditions and develop solutions to any problem. Rather than demanding conformity, the Imperium of this era sought to harness the full spectrum of human potential in service of species-wide greatness. The confidence and optimism of this period were infectious. Imperial forces approached each new challenge with the absolute certainty that they would not only overcome it, but would emerge stronger as a result. This was not mere arrogance. It was the justified confidence of a civilization that had repeatedly proven its ability to turn obstacles into opportunities and enemies into allies. Yet even in this golden age, careful observers might have noticed subtle signs that such perfection could not last indefinitely. The very success of the Crusade was creating new categories of challenges that had never been encountered before. The rapid pace of expansion was beginning to strain even the sophisticated administrative systems that had been developed to manage imperial growth. The increasing independence and confidence of the Primarchs, while beneficial in most ways, was also creating potential friction points within the command structure. More ominously, the sheer scope of imperial expansion was beginning to attract attention from powers that had remained dormant during humanity's long isolation. Ancient enemies that had been content to let the younger races struggle among themselves were beginning to take notice of the new empire rising from the Sol system. In the deepest reaches of space, things that had slept for eons were beginning to stir, drawn by the psychic emanations of a unified human civilization spanning millions of worlds. But these concerns remained largely theoretical during the Golden Age itself. The combination of military might, administrative excellence, and visionary leadership had created something that seemed genuinely unstoppable. The Great Crusade had become more than a military campaign. It had become a force of nature that was reshaping the galaxy according to the Emperor's will. The dream of human unity among the stars was no longer just a possibility. It was rapidly becoming an inevitable reality that would transform the cosmos forever. By the middle years of the 30th millennium, the Great Crusade had evolved beyond mere military conquest into something far more profound and transformative. What began as expeditionary fleets carrying warriors and administrators had become vessels of civilization itself, spreading not just imperial authority, but an entirely new way of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. The imperial truth was no longer just policy doctrine. It had become the philosophical foundation for the first truly galactic human culture in the species' history. The transformation was most visible in how newly compliant worlds adapted to imperial integration. Unlike the crude forced conversions that characterized earlier phases of expansion, the mature Crusade had developed sophisticated methods for cultural transformation that preserved valuable local traditions while eliminating elements that conflicted with imperial unity. This nuanced approach reflected hard-won experience in dealing with the incredible diversity of human civilization that had emerged during the Age of Strife. On the agri-world of Harvest Prime, imperial administrators discovered a population that had developed agricultural techniques so advanced they could feed 10 times their current population using only a fraction of their arable land. Rather than imposing standard imperial farming methods, the local integration team studied these innovations and adapted them for use throughout the sector. Within decades, food shortages that had plagued the region for centuries were eliminated, and Harvest Prime had become a training center where administrators from across the galaxy came to learn sustainable resource management. The world of Metallica presented different challenges and opportunities. Its population had maintained much of their Dark Age technology through a rigid techno-religious culture that viewed innovation as heresy and change as corruption. Imperial integration teams working closely with Mechanicum tech priests gradually demonstrated that the imperial truth's emphasis on rational understanding could actually enhance their technological capabilities rather than diminish them. The result was a forge world that combined the best of ancient knowledge with new innovations, becoming one of the most productive manufacturing centers in the growing empire. Perhaps most remarkably, the world of Colchis, demonstrated how even deeply religious populations could be successfully integrated into the secular framework of imperial civilization. The planet's inhabitants had developed sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions that, while superficially incompatible with the imperial truth, contained underlying rational principles that could be preserved and adapted. Under the careful guidance of Lorgar and his word-bearers Legion, Cultus became a model for how populations with strong spiritual traditions could find fulfillment within imperial culture without abandoning their fundamental values. These success stories were replicated thousands of times across the expanding empire, each representing a unique solution to the challenge of unifying humanity's scattered children. But success bred ambition, and imperial planners began to contemplate operations on a scale that would have been unthinkable during the Crusade's early years. Rather than targeting individual worlds or small clusters of systems, expeditionary fleets began planning sector-wide campaigns that would integrate entire regions of space in coordinated operations lasting decades. The Ulana Sector Campaign became the prototype for these massive undertakings. The region contained over 100 inhabited systems, including several major Orc empires that had been expanding aggressively for centuries. Previous imperial doctrine would have called for systematic reduction of each Orc stronghold, followed by individual integration of liberated human worlds. Instead, the campaign was planned as a single coordinated operation involving multiple expeditionary fleets, each specializing in specific aspects of the overall mission. The scale of coordination required was unprecedented in human military history. Logistics trains stretching across multiple star systems had to be established and maintained. Communications networks needed to relay information between dozens of different command centers while maintaining operational security. Most challenging of all, the diverse tactical approaches favored by different Primarchs had to be synchronized into a coherent strategic framework that maximized each legion's strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. But the Ulana campaign was more than just a military operation. It was a demonstration of what imperial civilization could achieve when all its elements worked in perfect harmony. As Space Marine forces eliminated Orc resistance and Imperial Army units secured liberated territories, massive engineering projects began reshaping entire worlds. Ancient Orc fortifications were demolished and replaced with Imperial infrastructure. Polluted environments were cleaned and restored to habitability. Most importantly, human populations that had survived Orc occupation were not just liberated, but integrated into prosperous communities that offered opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined. The economic implications of such large-scale operations were staggering. The resources required to support a sector-wide campaign exceeded the total production capacity of many individual worlds. Meeting these demands required innovations in logistics, manufacturing, and resource allocation that pushed Imperial administrative capabilities to new heights. Supply chains that had once been linear connections between production centers and consumption points evolved into complex networks that could adapt dynamically to changing operational requirements. Trade relationships that emerged from these campaigns created unprecedented prosperity throughout the expanding empire. Worlds that had struggled for survival during the Age of Strife suddenly found themselves part of economic networks spanning hundreds of light years. Specialization became possible on a scale that allowed individual worlds to focus on their greatest strengths while relying on imperial commerce to meet other needs. The result was an explosion of productivity and innovation that surpassed even the achievements of the Dark Age of technology. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a truly unified human culture for the first time in the species' history. The constant movement of imperial personnel, the exchange of ideas between previously isolated populations, and the shared experience of participating in the galaxy's greatest undertaking created bonds that transcended the regional variations that had characterized human civilization throughout its history. This cultural synthesis was most visible among the Space Marine legions themselves. Marines recruited from different worlds brought with them traditions, skills, and perspectives that enriched their legion's capabilities. The Lunar Wolves incorporated fighting techniques learned from gang warfare on Chthoniya. The White Scars adapted hunting practices from the plains of Chogoris. The Imperial Fists integrated architectural knowledge from the ice-bound fortresses of Inuit. Each legion became a living repository of the best human civilization had to offer. The Remembrancer program played a crucial role in this cultural development. Artists, writers, historians, and musicians attached to expeditionary fleets documented not just military achievements, but the human stories behind the conquest. Their work spread throughout imperial space, creating shared narratives that helped populations separated by vast distances feel connected to a common enterprise. The poetry of the Terran Renaissance, the songs of the Fenrisian Skalds, and the architectural styles of Ultramar began to appear on worlds that had never had direct contact with their places of origin. Communication improvements during this period revolutionized imperial governance. The expansion of the astropathic network, combined with advances in Vox technology and improved navigation, reduced transmission times across the Empire to levels that made real-time coordination possible for the first time. Imperial commanders could now conduct multi-system operations with confidence that their orders would reach subordinate units before tactical situations changed beyond recognition. Yet this very success began to create new categories of challenges that imperial planners had never anticipated. The rapid pace of expansion was generating administrative burdens that strained even the sophisticated systems developed during the Crusade's Golden Age. Each newly compliant world required detailed assessment, resource allocation, infrastructure development, and personnel assignment. The bureaucratic apparatus needed to manage these processes was growing at a rate that threatened to consume resources faster than conquered worlds could provide them. More subtly, the increasing scope and complexity of imperial operations was beginning to create distance between different levels of the command hierarchy. Primarchs who had once worked closely with their father now found themselves operating independently for years at a time, making decisions that affected millions of lives without direct guidance from Terra. While their loyalty remained absolute, their methods and priorities began to diverge in ways that reflected their individual personalities and the unique challenges they faced. Regional variations in imperial policy began to emerge as different expeditionary fleets adapted to local conditions. Some commanders favored aggressive integration that prioritized speed over diplomacy. Others developed more gradual approaches that emphasized consensus building and cultural preservation. While these variations were often appropriate responses to specific circumstances, they also created inconsistencies that sophisticated enemies could potentially exploit. The sheer scale of imperial success was also beginning to attract attention from powers that had remained neutral or dormant during humanity's period of weakness. Elder craft worlds that had initially viewed the Great Crusade as a temporary disturbance began to recognize that imperial expansion represented a fundamental shift in galactic power structures. Their farseers spoke increasingly of dark futures, where humanity's psychic awakening would trigger catastrophes that could destroy entire sectors. Ancient Xeno civilizations that had survived by avoiding conflict with younger races found themselves facing a choice between accommodation and resistance. As imperial fleets approached their territories, some attempted diplomatic contact, seeking to negotiate boundaries or tribute arrangements that would preserve their independence. Others began preparing for wars of extermination, recognizing that imperial doctrine offered no possibility of coexistence between human and Xenos governance. Perhaps most ominously, the growing psychic emanations of a unified human civilization were beginning to resonate through the warp in ways that attracted attention from entities that had remained largely dormant since the collapse of the Eldar Empire. These ancient intelligences, some of which predated human civilization entirely, began to take active interest in the species that was rapidly becoming the dominant psychic presence in the galaxy. The philosophical implications of imperial expansion were equally complex. The imperial truth had been designed to eliminate superstition and replace religious thinking with rational materialism. But the very success of the Great Crusade was creating evidence that some aspects of reality transcended purely material explanation. The Emperor's obvious superhuman capabilities, the psychic abilities of navigators and astropaths, and the strange phenomena encountered during warp travel all suggested that the universe contained elements that didn't fit comfortably within strict materialist frameworks. These contradictions were most apparent to the Primarchs themselves, who possessed capabilities that defied rational explanation, while being expected to champion purely scientific worldviews. Some, like Robert Gilliman, resolved this tension by focusing on practical governance rather than theoretical consistency. Others, like Magnus the Red, became increasingly interested in understanding the underlying principles that made their abilities possible, even when such investigations led them toward knowledge that imperial doctrine classified as dangerous. Cultural integration challenges were becoming more complex, as the Crusade encountered populations with increasingly sophisticated philosophical and religious traditions. Early imperial encounters had primarily involved either technologically primitive societies or populations that had regressed to barbarism during the Age of Strife. But as expansion continued, imperial forces began encountering civilizations that had not only survived the Dark Years, but had actually flourished, developing rich cultural traditions that their populations were reluctant to abandon. The question of how to handle these encounters began to divide imperial leadership. Some argued for strict adherence to the imperial truth, insisting that any deviation from rational materialism would weaken the philosophical foundations of imperial unity. Others contended that excessive rigidity could create unnecessary resistance, and that the ultimate goal of human unity was more important than ideological purity. These debates would continue throughout the remaining years of the Great Crusade, growing more intense as the contradictions within imperial philosophy became increasingly difficult to ignore. Despite these growing tensions, the middle years of the 30th millennium represented the absolute pinnacle of human achievement and cooperation. Never before had so many different human populations worked together toward common goals. Never had technological and cultural exchange occurred on such a vast scale. Never had the dream of true unity among the stars seemed so close to realization. But even as imperial fleets pushed ever deeper into the galaxy, carrying the light of human civilization to the darkest corners of space, the seeds of future catastrophe were already beginning to sprout. The very qualities that made the Great Crusade successful, the independence of its leaders, the diversity of its methods, and the ambition of its goals, were also creating the conditions that would eventually tear it apart. The golden age of imperial expansion was nearing its end, though none who lived through its glory could have imagined the darkness that was soon to follow. The earliest warnings came not as dramatic revelations, but as minor anomalies that experienced commanders learned to dismiss as routine hazards of interstellar warfare. A navigator reporting strange dreams during warp transit through the ghoul stars. Equipment malfunctions aboard ships that had operated flawlessly for decades. Crew members suffering from inexplicable bouts of paranoia or melancholy after visiting certain systems. These incidents were filed away in routine reports, logged as curiosities rather than omens of the catastrophe that was slowly building in the depths of space itself. Captain Erasmus Hagen of the 203rd Expeditionary Fleet would later become famous for filing the first comprehensive report documenting what scholars now recognize as early manifestations of chaos corruption. His fleet had been conducting compliance operations in the Perdus sector, a region where fragmentary records suggested the existence of several human colonies that had maintained advanced technology throughout the Age of Strife. What they discovered instead were worlds where reality itself seemed to follow different rules than elsewhere in the galaxy. On Miral Prime, Imperial scouts found a human civilization that had indeed preserved much of their Dark Age heritage, but at a cost that became apparent only after extended observation. The population exhibited technological capabilities that exceeded even Mechanicum standards, yet their cities were built according to architectural principles that seemed to hurt the mind when studied too closely. Geometric patterns that appeared perfectly normal from one angle became disturbing or impossible when viewed from different perspectives. Most troubling of all, the inhabitants seemed unaware that anything was unusual about their environment. The planetary government welcomed imperial contact with enthusiasm that bordered on desperate relief. Their leaders spoke eloquently about their desire to rejoin the greater human community after millennia of isolation. They offered technologies and resources that would have been invaluable to the Crusade effort. Yet something about their eagerness felt wrong to the imperial negotiators, a quality that experienced diplomats described as the enthusiasm of drowning people who had suddenly spotted a rescue ship. Initial compliance, negotiations proceeded normally until imperial tech priests attempted to examine the advanced manufacturing systems that formed the backbone of Miral's economy. The machines functioned perfectly, producing goods of exceptional quality and complexity. But the principles governing their operation defied rational analysis. Power sources that should have been insufficient drove processes that violated known laws of thermodynamics. Manufacturing techniques produced materials with properties that existing scientific models claimed were impossible. When pressed for explanations, Miral's technicians provided documentation that appeared comprehensive and detailed. The technical manuals were written in perfect High Gothic, illustrated with precise diagrams and organized according to standard imperial formats. Yet careful study revealed that the information they contained was fundamentally meaningless. Mathematical equations that looked correct at first glance dissolved into nonsense under detailed analysis. Procedural instructions that seemed logical actually described impossible sequences of actions. Similar problems emerged when imperial administrators attempted to assess the planet's population and resources. Census data provided by local authorities was internally consistent and presented in familiar formats, but cross-referencing revealed discrepancies that grew more pronounced the deeper investigators dug. Demographic statistics that indicated sustainable population growth were contradicted by infrastructure assessments that suggested declining habitation. Economic data showed thriving commercial activity in regions where orbital surveys detected no signs of industrial development. The breakthrough came when Remembrancer Octavia Meir began interviewing individual citizens about their personal histories and experiences. The stories she collected were fascinating, full of rich detail about family traditions, local customs, and historical events. But when she attempted to correlate these individual accounts into a coherent picture of Mirrell's past, the results were impossible to reconcile. Different people described the same historical events in ways that were not just inconsistent, but mutually contradictory, as if they had experienced entirely different versions of reality. More disturbing still were the gaps that appeared in people's memories when questioned about specific details. Citizens who spoke eloquently about their childhood experiences became vague and confused when asked about particular dates or locations. Detailed descriptions of family members became uncertain when pressed for names or specific relationships. It was as if the population's memories were simultaneously completely genuine and entirely fabricated. The first deaths occurred during what should have been routine technical assessments. Tech adept Valen Krosk was examining a manufacturing facility when he apparently suffered some kind of seizure that left him catatonic. Medical examination revealed no physical cause for his condition, but colleagues reported that in the hours before his collapse, he had become increasingly agitated, claiming that the machinery he was studying was singing to him in ways that made his head feel like it was splitting apart. Similar incidents began affecting other Imperial personnel with increasing frequency. Navigators reported that approaching Mirrell Prime felt like steering towards something that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. Astropaths complained of psychic interference that made communication difficult, describing their attempts to send messages as shouting into a choir that sang back in languages that shouldn't exist. Even regular Imperial Army troopers began experiencing headaches, nightmares, and episodes of disorientation that seemed to worsen the longer they remained on the planet. Captain Hagen made the decision to withdraw from Mirrell Prime after consulting with his senior staff and determining that the risks to Imperial personnel outweighed any potential benefits from establishing compliance. The withdrawal itself proved more difficult than anticipated, as several crew members reported feeling physically ill when ordered to leave the planet, describing a sensation like being pulled away from something essential to their existence. The official report filed by the 203rd Expeditionary Fleet classified Mirrell Prime as requiring further investigation by specialized personnel before compliance could be established. But copies of the report that circulated among experienced fleet commanders began to generate discussion about similar incidents that had been dismissed as isolated curiosities. The Battle Brothers of the Iron Warriors reported encountering fortifications on the world of Olympia's Reach that seemed to rebuild themselves overnight, with architectural features that appeared different depending on who was observing them. Navigator House Quintanus privately circulated warnings about certain warp routes where their members reported experiencing visions that seemed more real than the physical universe. These visions typically involved encounters with entities that claimed to be representatives of powers far older than human civilization, beings that offered knowledge and assistance in exchange for considerations that were never clearly defined. Navigators who accepted these offers invariably reported improved abilities and enhanced perception, but their colleagues noted personality changes that became more pronounced over time. The Thousand Suns Legion began documenting incidents during their campaigns in the eastern fringes, where reality appeared to operate according to principles that contradicted imperial scientific understanding. Entire worlds where the laws of physics seemed negotiable rather than absolute, where psychic phenomena occurred with frequencies that should have been impossible, where ancient ruins contained technologies that achieved their effects through methods that defied rational analysis. Perhaps most troubling were the reports filtering back from expeditionary fleets, operating in regions where ancient stellar cartography indicated the former locations of major Xenos civilizations. These areas exhibited spatial anomalies that made navigation treacherous, with some ships reporting travel times that were either impossibly short or inexplicably extended. More disturbing were the accounts of fleets that encountered derelict vessels of unknown origin, ships whose designs incorporated architectural elements that seemed familiar despite having no precedent in human or known Xenos technology. The pattern that emerged from these scattered reports suggested something far more systematic than random equipment failures or isolated phenomena. Experienced commanders began to recognize that certain regions of the galaxy exhibited consistent problems that followed predictable patterns. Warp travel became increasingly unreliable in specific sectors. Psychic phenomena occurred with unusual frequency near systems that had been abandoned for millennia. Most ominously, Imperial personnel operating in these regions began displaying behavioral changes that suggested exposure to influences that couldn't be detected or measured using standard Imperial technology. Tech priests of the Mechanicum were among the first to recognize that these incidents might represent contact with forces that operated according to principles fundamentally different from the rational materialism that formed the foundation of Imperial doctrine. Their attempts to develop countermeasures were hampered by the fact that the phenomena they were trying to combat seemed to respond to observation and analysis in ways that suggested conscious intelligence rather than simple natural laws. The theological implications were profound and troubling. The Imperial truth explicitly denied the existence of supernatural forces, insisting that all phenomena could be understood and controlled through rational scientific methodology. But the accumulating evidence suggested the existence of intelligences that operated outside the boundaries of material reality, entities that could influence events in the physical universe without being subject to physical laws. Debates within Imperial command circles began to center on whether these incidents represented encounters with unknown Xenos species using advanced technology, manifestations of psychic phenomena that were poorly understood, or evidence of forces that truly transcended the material universe. Each explanation had different implications for imperial doctrine and strategy, but none offered easy solutions to the growing problem of expeditionary fleets reporting encounters that defied rational explanation. The emperor himself remained largely silent on these developing concerns, apparently focusing his attention on projects that were classified beyond the clearance levels of even senior Primarchs. When pressed for guidance by concerned commanders, he typically provided specific tactical instructions for dealing with immediate problems without addressing the larger philosophical questions that these incidents raised. This approach was pragmatically effective, but left imperial leadership without clear doctrinal guidance for handling phenomena that challenged the foundational assumptions of their civilization. Some Primarchs began developing their own approaches to these challenges based on their personal philosophies and experiences. Robert Guilliman emphasized practical solutions over theoretical consistency, arguing that the important thing was protecting imperial personnel and achieving strategic objectives regardless of whether current doctrine could explain the threats they faced. Magnus the Red took a more academic approach, seeking to understand the underlying principles governing these phenomena, even when such research led him toward knowledge that imperial doctrine classified as potentially dangerous. The word-bearers presented a unique case, as their pre-compliance culture on Colchis had included traditions that seemed to anticipate some of the phenomena now being encountered by imperial forces. Lorga's intimate knowledge of religious and mystical traditions made him valuable as a consultant on incidents that defied scientific explanation, but it also put him at odds with the strict materialism that the imperial truth demanded. As reports continued to accumulate, pattern analysis suggested that the frequency and intensity of these incidents were increasing over time. Areas of space that had been considered safe for imperial operations were developing problems that made them hazardous or impossible to navigate. More troubling still, the solutions that proved effective in one situation often failed completely when applied to similar incidents elsewhere, as if the challenges were adapting to imperial countermeasures in real time. The psychological impact on imperial personnel was becoming a serious concern. Crews that had operated effectively for years began exhibiting signs of stress and paranoia after exposure to these anomalous conditions. Some requested transfers to different assignments, claiming that they could no longer trust their own perceptions after witnessing events that contradicted everything they had been taught about the nature of reality. Others became obsessively interested in understanding the phenomena they had encountered, pursuing research into subjects that imperial doctrine discouraged or explicitly prohibited. Training programs began incorporating warnings about psychological hazards that might be encountered during certain types of operations, but instructors found it difficult to provide specific guidance without acknowledging the existence of threats that imperial doctrine insisted were impossible. The result was a growing sense among operational personnel that they were being asked to confront dangers that their superiors either didn't understand or weren't willing to discuss openly. As the Great Crusade entered what would later be recognized as its final phase, these accumulating anomalies represented cracks in the foundation of imperial certainty that had sustained 2 centuries of unprecedented expansion. The rational universe that the Emperor had promised his followers was proving to be more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated, populated by intelligences and forces that viewed humanity's rise with interest that was far from benevolent. The turning point came not with a single catastrophic event, but through the gradual recognition that the scattered incidents plaguing imperial forces represented contact with intelligences that possessed both malevolent intent and capabilities that transcended conventional understanding. What had initially been dismissed as equipment malfunctions or psychological stress among crews operating in dangerous regions was revealed to be something far more sinister and systematic. The breakthrough in understanding came from an unexpected source. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor, and one of the few individuals trusted with the deepest secrets of imperial policy, requested comprehensive analysis of all anomalous incidents reported by expeditionary fleets over the previous 50 years. The resulting data compilation revealed patterns that individual fleet commanders operating in isolation could never have detected. The phenomena were not random. They clustered around specific stellar coordinates that corresponded to regions where ancient records indicated major psychic events had occurred during the collapse of previous civilizations. They intensified during periods when large numbers of imperial psykers were operating in proximity to each other. Most ominously, they seemed to respond to the emotional and psychological states of the humans who encountered them, becoming more pronounced when imperial personnel experienced stress, doubt, or despair. The first confirmed daemon manifestation occurred aboard the battle barge Faithful Servant during routine warp transit between the Ghoul stars and imperial territory. Navigator Prima Thessarian reported unusual turbulence in the local warp currents, but nothing that seemed to threaten the vessel's safety. The ship's Geller field was functioning normally. All systems showed green indicators, and the estimated time to destination remained within acceptable parameters. The entity that materialized in the ship's primary navigation chamber bore no resemblance to any Xeno species in imperial xenobiological databases. It appeared to be composed partially of energy and partially of substance that shifted between different states of matter without regard for known physical laws. More disturbing than its appearance was its ability to communicate directly with human minds, speaking in languages that the listeners instinctively understood, despite never having learned them. The daemon, for lack of a better classification, claimed to represent powers that had existed since before the birth of stars. It spoke eloquently about the futility of human ambition in a universe where consciousness itself was merely a game played by entities that viewed mortal existence as temporary entertainment. Most unsettling of all, it demonstrated detailed knowledge of imperial operations, personnel records, and strategic planning that should have been impossible for any external intelligence to obtain. Brother Captain Marcus Aurelius of the Imperial Fists, who was aboard the Faithful Servant as part of an interlegion coordination mission, immediately ordered his battle brothers to engage the entity. Bolter fire passed harmlessly through the daemon's form, while power weapons caused it to laugh with genuine amusement. The creature seemed to find the Space Marine's attempts at resistance entertaining rather than threatening, commenting that their courage was admirable but fundamentally misguided. The daemon's departure was as sudden as its arrival, but not before it had delivered a message that would haunt imperial leadership for years to come. It claimed that humanity's expansion across the galaxy was proceeding according to plans laid down by intelligences far older than human civilization, that the Great Crusade itself was serving purposes that the Emperor could not possibly understand. Most disturbing of all, it suggested that the very qualities that made humanity great, their psychic potential and capacity for unified action, were also making them valuable servants for powers that viewed mortal existence as raw material for larger projects. News of the faithful servant incident spread through informal channels among senior imperial commanders, despite official attempts to classify the information. Similar encounters were reported with increasing frequency across multiple sectors, each following patterns that suggested coordinated activity rather than random phenomena. The entities involved demonstrated consistent behavioral characteristics and seemed to share information about Imperial operations and personnel. The response from Imperial leadership varied dramatically depending on philosophical orientation and personal experience. Some commanders advocated for aggressive countermeasures, arguing that any threat to Imperial expansion needed to be eliminated regardless of its nature or origin. Others counseled caution, pointing out that engaging enemies whose capabilities were poorly understood could lead to catastrophic consequences for entire expeditionary fleets. The Emperor's reaction to these developments remained characteristically enigmatic. Rather than issuing clear doctrinal guidance about how to handle daemon encounters, he provided specific tactical instructions for individual incidents, while apparently intensifying work on classified projects that even the Primarchs were not fully briefed about. This pattern suggested that he possessed knowledge about the current crisis that he was not sharing with his subordinates, possibly for reasons related to operational security or psychological morale. Magnus the Red became the most prominent advocate for intensive study of daemon phenomena, arguing that understanding these entities was essential for developing effective countermeasures. His research teams on Prospero began collecting accounts from across the galaxy, analyzing incident reports for patterns that might reveal weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The results of these studies were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The entities demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. They could manifest in normal space without apparent regard for conservation of energy or mass. They possessed detailed knowledge of events occurring across vast distances with no apparent communication delays. Most troubling of all, they seemed to exist partially outside normal temporal flow, demonstrating awareness of future events that hadn't yet occurred, and referencing past incidents that had been carefully classified. Magnus's research revealed that daemon encounters were not entirely random, but followed patterns that suggested some form of strategic intelligence behind their activities. The entities seemed particularly interested in Imperial personnel with strong psychic potential, often attempting to establish communication or offering bargains that involved enhanced abilities in exchange for unspecified services. Those who accepted these offers invariably reported significant improvements in their psychic capabilities, but colleagues noted personality changes that became more pronounced over time. The philosophical implications were staggering and directly contradicted the imperial truth that formed the ideological foundation of the Great Crusade. If these entities truly existed outside the material universe, while still being able to influence physical events, then the rational materialism that the Emperor had championed was at best incomplete and at worst fundamentally wrong. The existence of daemons suggested the presence of spiritual or metaphysical dimensions to reality that imperial doctrine explicitly denied. Lorgar and the Word-Bearers found themselves in a uniquely complex position regarding these developments. Their pre-compliance culture on Cultius had included extensive traditions dealing with spiritual entities and metaphysical phenomena, knowledge that proved surprisingly relevant to current circumstances. Lorgar's ability to understand and communicate with daemon entities made him valuable for intelligence gathering, but it also put him in direct conflict with imperial doctrine that insisted such beings couldn't exist. The practical challenges of conducting military operations under these conditions were immense. Standard tactical doctrine assumed that enemies would follow predictable patterns based on physical limitations and logical decision-making processes. Daemons operated according to principles that defied both assumptions, making conventional military planning extremely difficult. Weapons that proved effective in one encounter might be completely useless in the next, and strategic planning was complicated by enemies who seemed to possess precognitive abilities. Training programs were hastily developed to prepare Imperial personnel for daemon encounters, but instructors found it nearly impossible to provide useful guidance without acknowledging the existence of threats that Imperial doctrine insisted were impossible. The result was a growing disconnect between official policy and operational reality that created confusion and demoralization among frontline units. Equipment modifications began appearing throughout Imperial forces as commanders attempted to develop countermeasures based on field experience rather than theoretical understanding. Psychic wards, blessed weapons, and ritual purification procedures became common practice despite having no basis in approved Imperial doctrine. These improvised solutions were often effective, but their success raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between faith, superstition, and practical military effectiveness. The psychological impact on Imperial personnel was becoming a critical factor in operational planning. Daemon encounters invariably left survivors questioning fundamental assumptions about reality and their place in the universe. Many reported experiencing existential crises that affected their ability to perform duties effectively. Others became obsessed with understanding the nature of daemon existence, pursuing research into subjects that Imperial doctrine discouraged or prohibited. Perhaps most troubling were the personnel who claimed that daemon encounters had actually been beneficial experiences. These individuals reported enhanced intuition, improved decision-making abilities, and deeper understanding of complex problems. Medical examinations revealed no obvious signs of corruption or coercion, but their colleagues noticed subtle personality changes that became more pronounced over time. These cases suggested that daemon influence might be more subtle and insidious than initially understood. The strategic implications of widespread daemon activity were profound and disturbing. If these entities possessed the capabilities they demonstrated, then Imperial expansion might be proceeding according to plans laid down by intelligence that viewed human civilization as raw material for larger projects. The possibility that the Great Crusade itself might be serving daemon objectives rather than human interests was too terrible to contemplate openly, but it haunted the private thoughts of many senior commanders. Communication security became a major concern as daemons demonstrated knowledge of classified information that should have been impossible for external intelligences to obtain. Standard encryption and communication protocols proved ineffective against entities that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. New security procedures were developed based on psychic shielding and ritual protection, but these measures were difficult to implement without acknowledging the existence of threats that official doctrine denied. The strain on Imperial logistics was becoming significant as more resources were diverted to Daemon countermeasures and personnel recovery programs. Specialized equipment, protective rituals, and psychological counseling services required investments that reduced the efficiency of conventional military operations. Some expeditionary fleets found themselves spending more time and resources dealing with Daemon-related problems than conducting actual conquest operations. As reports continued to accumulate, it became clear that Daemon activity was not only increasing in frequency, but also in sophistication and coordination. The entities seemed to be learning from their encounters with Imperial forces, adapting their tactics in response to defensive measures. More ominously, they appeared to be working together toward objectives that remained unclear, but seemed to involve the corruption or recruitment of key Imperial personnel. The Great Crusade, which had begun as humanity's greatest triumph, was gradually being transformed into something that served purposes beyond human understanding. The rational universe that the Emperor had promised his followers was revealing itself to be populated by intelligences that viewed mortal existence as raw material for cosmic games, whose rules and objectives remained hidden from human comprehension. Yet even as the Daemon threat became undeniable, Imperial expansion continued at an unprecedented pace. The momentum of 2 centuries of success carried the Crusade forward, even as its leadership grappled with challenges that threatened the philosophical foundations of their entire civilization. The stage was set for a confrontation between human ambition and cosmic forces that would determine not just the fate of the Imperium, but the future of consciousness itself in the galaxy. The realization that conventional Imperial doctrine was inadequate for confronting the Daemon threat triggered a period of frantic innovation that pushed the boundaries of everything the Great Crusade had previously considered acceptable. Principles that had remained inviolate since the Emperor first proclaimed the Imperial truth were quietly set aside in favor of pragmatic solutions that prioritized survival over ideological purity. The transformation was gradual but profound, representing a fundamental shift in how Imperial forces understood their place in a universe that had proven far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. The librarian program emerged as one of the most controversial departures from established doctrine. Previously, Imperial policy had called for the elimination or strict control of psykers throughout human space, viewing psychic abilities as dangerous mutations that threatened the genetic purity of the species. But Daemon encounters had demonstrated that psychic phenomena were not merely biological aberrations, but fundamental aspects of reality that could be harnessed as weapons against enemies that existed partially outside normal space-time. Magnus the Red became the most prominent advocate for expanding psyker integration throughout Imperial forces. His arguments were compelling and backed by extensive research data collected from Daemon encounters across multiple sectors. Psykers who had received proper training and equipment could detect Daemon presence before it became visible to normal humans. They could disrupt Daemon manifestations using techniques that conventional weapons couldn't match. Most importantly, they could provide early warning systems that might prevent entire fleets from falling victim to surprise Daemon attacks. The implementation of the librarian program required innovations in training, equipment, and organizational structure that challenged long-established Imperial practices. Psykers who had previously been viewed with suspicion or outright hostility were suddenly being recruited as essential personnel for the most dangerous and important missions. Training facilities had to be established to teach techniques that bordered on the mystical, using methods that couldn't be explained through rational scientific principles. Perhaps more troubling were the modifications to existing doctrine that accompanied these changes. The imperial truth had explicitly rejected any acknowledgement of spiritual or supernatural phenomena, insisting that all aspects of reality could be understood through rational materialism. But effective daemon countermeasures required acceptance of metaphysical concepts that directly contradicted these foundational principles. Protective rituals, blessed weapons, and psychic wards became standard equipment despite having no basis in approved imperial science. The Mechanicum faced particularly complex challenges in adapting to these new realities. Their religious devotion to the machine god had always existed in tension with the imperial truth's secular materialism, but daemon encounters forced them to confront the possibility that their spiritual beliefs might actually be more accurate than imperial scientific doctrine. Tech priests began incorporating protective prayers and ritual purifications into their maintenance procedures, claiming that these practices improved equipment reliability in regions where daemon activity was common. Weapons technology underwent revolutionary changes as imperial forces attempted to develop armaments effective against entities that existed partially outside normal physical reality. The development of consecrated ammunition, psychically charged power cells, and blessed weapon oils became standard practice throughout the imperial arsenal. These modifications were often effective against daemon targets, but their success raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between faith, technology, and practical military effectiveness. The most dramatic innovations occurred in the realm of strategic planning and operational doctrine. Traditional military planning assumed that enemies would follow predictable patterns based on logical objectives and physical limitations. Daemons operated according to principles that defied both assumptions, forcing imperial commanders to develop entirely new approaches to campaign planning and tactical decision-making. Intelligence gathering became exponentially more complex as imperial forces attempted to understand enemies whose motivations and capabilities transcended conventional analysis. Interrogation techniques that had proven effective against human and Xenos prisoners were useless against daemon entities that seemed to view questioning as entertainment rather than coercion. Information warfare took on new dimensions when dealing with enemies who possessed apparent precognitive abilities and could access classified data through means that defied technological explanation. Communication security required complete overhaul, as daemons demonstrated the ability to intercept and corrupt messages transmitted through standard imperial networks. New protocols were developed based on psychic shielding and ritual protection, but these measures were difficult to implement without acknowledging the existence of threats that official doctrine continued to deny. The result was a growing disconnect between public imperial policy and operational reality that created confusion and demoralization among personnel at all levels. Training programs were revolutionized to prepare imperial personnel for encounters with enemies that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Instructors found themselves teaching techniques that had no basis in approved imperial doctrine, using methods that bordered on the mystical to prepare soldiers for battles that couldn't be won through conventional military means. Psychological conditioning became as important as physical training, as personnel needed to maintain combat effectiveness while confronting enemies that could induce existential terror through their mere presence. The strain on imperial logistics became enormous as more resources were diverted to daemon countermeasures and specialized equipment development. Manufacturing priorities shifted from conventional military hardware to exotic items like psychically charged ammunition, blessed oils, and protective talismans. Supply chains that had been optimized for standard military operations were forced to accommodate requisitions for materials and components that didn't fit into existing classification systems. Perhaps most significantly, the Emperor himself began emerging from the deep vaults of terror, more frequently, providing direct guidance for dealing with daemon-related crises that had proven too complex for standard imperial responses. These interventions were invariably effective, but they also revealed capabilities and knowledge that even his closest advisors hadn't suspected. The Emperor's ability to banish daemon entities through direct psychic confrontation demonstrated powers that transcended anything previously witnessed, suggesting that he possessed understanding of cosmic forces that he had never shared with his subordinates. The Webway Project, long rumored to be the Emperor's most secret undertaking, began to take on new significance as imperial forces struggled with the dangers of warp travel in regions where daemon activity was common. Fragmentary reports suggested that the Emperor was attempting to create an alternative to warp-based interstellar travel, a network of tunnels through space itself that would allow imperial forces to move between systems without exposure to the entities that inhabited the immaterium. But the most profound changes were philosophical rather than technological. The imperial truth, which had served as the ideological foundation for 2 centuries of expansion, was quietly being modified to accommodate realities that it had originally been designed to deny. Official doctrine still rejected supernatural explanations for observed phenomena, but operational procedures increasingly incorporated practices that were indistinguishable from the religious rituals that imperial policy had supposedly eliminated. This transformation was most visible among the Space Marine legions, where battle brothers began developing personal rituals and protective practices that drew on cultural traditions from their recruitment worlds. The Space Wolves incorporated elements of Fenrisian shamanism into their combat preparations. The Salamanders adopted forge blessings that resembled the fire worship of their home world, Nocturne. Even the rational Ultramarines began using ceremonial phrases and protective gestures that had no basis in approved imperial doctrine. The psychological impact of these changes on imperial personnel was complex and far-reaching. Many experienced a sense of relief that official policy was finally acknowledging the reality of threats they had been facing for years. Others felt betrayed by leadership that had insisted on doctrinal purity, while secretly developing countermeasures that contradicted everything they had been taught. The cognitive dissonance created by the gap between public doctrine and operational reality created stress and confusion throughout the imperial hierarchy. Regional variations in daemon countermeasures began to emerge as different commanders developed solutions based on local conditions and cultural resources. Some expeditionary fleets incorporated elements from the pre-compliance religious traditions of their recruitment worlds. Others developed entirely new practices based on trial and error experimentation with psychic phenomena. The result was a patchwork of different approaches that were often effective in specific circumstances, but difficult to standardize across the entire imperial military. The Primarchs themselves responded to these challenges in ways that reflected their individual personalities and philosophical orientations. Robot Guilliman focused on developing systematic procedures that could be taught and implemented consistently across large organizations. Leman Russ embraced approaches that drew on the shamanistic traditions of Fenris, arguing that ancient wisdom often contained practical insights that rational analysis had overlooked. Lorga became increasingly interested in understanding the theological implications of daemon existence, pursuing research that put him at odds with official imperial doctrine. The success of these innovative approaches was undeniable, but it came at a cost that many imperial leaders found troubling. The modifications to doctrine and procedure that proved effective against daemons also created precedents for further departures from established imperial policy. Personnel who had been trained to use psychic techniques and ritual practices in military contexts began applying these methods to civilian situations, creating unauthorized variations in imperial culture that were difficult to monitor or control. The Ulnar Triumph, held at the end of the successful campaign against the largest Orc empire yet encountered, represented both the pinnacle of imperial military achievement and the beginning of a new phase in the Great Crusade's evolution. The Emperor's decision to appoint Horus as War Master and withdraw from direct operational command came at a moment when imperial forces were grappling with challenges that transcended conventional military understanding. Horus's appointment was widely celebrated throughout imperial space, as his combination of military genius and diplomatic skill made him ideally suited for coordinating the complex multi-legion operations that had become standard practice. But his elevation to supreme command also meant that responsibility for managing daemon-related crises would fall primarily on the Primarchs rather than the Emperor himself, a change that would prove to have profound and unexpected consequences. As the Great Crusade entered its final phase, the innovations that had been developed to combat daemon threats had fundamentally transformed the nature of imperial civilization. The rational materialism that had once characterized imperial culture had given way to a more complex worldview that acknowledged the existence of forces beyond conventional understanding. The change had been necessary for survival, but it had also created conditions that would eventually be exploited by the very enemies it was designed to combat. The stage was set for confrontations that would test not only imperial military capabilities, but the philosophical foundations of everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve. The innovations that had preserved imperial expansion in the face of daemon threats had also created vulnerabilities that cosmic intelligences were already beginning to exploit. The final act of humanity's greatest triumph was about to begin, and its outcome would reshape the galaxy for 10,000 years to come. The corruption began not with a single moment of weakness, but through a gradual erosion of certainty that had been building for decades among the Primarchs and their legions. The philosophical challenges posed by daemon encounters, the modifications to imperial doctrine, and the increasing independence required by galactic-scale operations had created conditions where even the most loyal servants of the Emperor began to question fundamental assumptions about their purpose and their father's vision for humanity's future. Lorgar's transformation became the catalyst for everything that would follow. The destruction of Monarchia, the crown jewel of Cultus, that he had rebuilt as a monument to the Emperor's glory, represented more than just punishment for violating the imperial truth. It was a public humiliation that struck at the heart of Lorgar's identity and purpose, delivered by the very being he had worshipped as divine since childhood. The Word-Bearers Legion was forced to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement, while Roboute Guilliman's Ultramarines stood watch, turning brother against brother in a display of imperial authority that would poison relationships between the legions for years to come. But the true devastation was psychological rather than physical. Lorgar had genuinely believed that his religious devotion honored the Emperor and strengthened the bonds between father and sons. The violent rejection of his faith left him spiritually adrift, desperately seeking new sources of meaning and purpose that could fill the void left by his shattered beliefs. His pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror with a select group of trusted Word-Bearers was ostensibly a journey of penance and reflection, but it became something far more dangerous. The entities that Lorgar encountered in that realm of perpetual storm spoke to him with voices that resonated through dimensions he had never suspected existed. They offered knowledge that the Emperor had denied him, purpose that transcended the limitations of mortal existence, and power that could reshape reality according to his deepest desires. Most seductively, they provided explanations for the contradictions and mysteries that had plagued imperial doctrine since daemon encounters began. These chaos powers, as they revealed themselves to be, claimed that the Emperor had been deceiving humanity about the true nature of the universe. The rational materialism of the imperial truth was not just incomplete, but actively harmful, preventing human beings from accessing their full potential as psychic entities capable of transcending physical limitations. The daemons that imperial forces had been fighting were not invaders but teachers, attempting to guide humanity toward evolutionary advancement that the Emperor sought to prevent for his own selfish purposes. The theological framework that emerged from Lorgar's experiences in the Eye of Terror provided answers to questions that had tormented him since Monarchia's destruction. If the Emperor truly possessed divine capabilities but rejected worship, it was because he feared that humanity's spiritual development would diminish his own power. If daemon encounters challenged imperial doctrine, it was because these entities represented forces of change and growth that threatened the Emperor's desire to keep humanity in a state of perpetual dependence. The warrior lodges that had existed informally throughout the Space Marine legions became the primary vector for chaos corruption. These brotherhood organizations, originally created to foster bonds between battle brothers from different companies and backgrounds, provided perfect cover for disseminating new ideas and alternative interpretations of imperial doctrine. Lodge meetings, conducted in secret away from official oversight, became forums for questioning established policies and exploring forbidden knowledge. The corruption spread through personal relationships and individual conversations rather than grand declarations or open rebellion. Trusted sergeants shared doubts about imperial policy with their squad members. Veteran captains discussed philosophical concerns with junior officers they were mentoring. Chaplains began incorporating subtle modifications into their sermons that gradually shifted emphasis from imperial doctrine toward more mystical interpretations of human potential. The process was accelerated by the practical challenges that imperial forces continued to face in dealing with daemon threats. Personnel who had been authorized to use psychic techniques and ritual practices for military purposes began experimenting with more advanced applications that promised greater effectiveness against supernatural enemies. These experiments invariably produced positive results, reinforcing the idea that imperial doctrine was unnecessarily restrictive and that greater power was available to those willing to pursue forbidden knowledge. Horus's corruption followed a different but equally devastating pattern. Unlike Lorgar's philosophical crisis, the War Master's fall began with a physical wound sustained during what should have been a routine compliance action on the moon of Davin. The weapon that injured him had been corrupted by chaos influence in ways that made conventional medical treatment ineffective, leaving the most beloved of the Primarchs dying slowly while his subordinates watched helplessly. The healing ritual offered by Davin's Lodge brothers appeared to be humanity's last hope for preserving the life of the being who had become the living symbol of the Great Crusade's success. The ceremony itself seemed to follow patterns familiar from other worlds where shamanistic traditions had proved effective against daemon threats. But the healing came at a price that became apparent only gradually, as Horus recovered his physical strength while losing the psychological certainties that had anchored his loyalty to the Emperor. The visions that Horus experienced during his recovery painted a terrifying picture of humanity's future under continued imperial rule. He saw worlds stripped of resources to feed the Emperor's vanity projects, populations enslaved to serve the construction of monuments to divine ego, and his brother Primarchs gradually eliminated as threats to their father's absolute authority. Most disturbing of all, he witnessed his own fate, reduced from honored son and trusted general to obsolete tool discarded when his usefulness ended. But the visions also showed alternative futures where humanity achieved its true potential under different leadership, guided by beings who understood the full scope of psychic evolution. The species could transcend physical limitations entirely, becoming entities of pure consciousness capable of reshaping reality through will alone. The chaos powers that had been portrayed as enemies were revealed as potential allies, cosmic forces that sought to elevate younger races to levels of existence that the Emperor actively sought to prevent. The psychological impact of these revelations on Horus was devastating and transformative. The absolute loyalty he had felt toward the Emperor was replaced by a growing conviction that his father was not just wrong about humanity's future, but actively working to prevent the species from achieving its destiny. The love and respect that had bound him to his creator became resentment and ultimately hatred as he began to believe that everything he had accomplished during the Great Crusade had served purposes that contradicted his deepest values. The corruption of other Primarchs followed patterns tailored to their individual personalities and concerns. Fulgrim's perfectionist nature was exploited through promises of aesthetic and physical enhancement beyond anything achieved through conventional means. Perturbo's resentment about being assigned the most difficult and thankless tasks was fed by suggestions that his father deliberately sought to limit his achievements. Angren's rage against the injustices he had experienced was channeled into hatred for the imperial system that had failed to protect the innocent. Each corruption was carefully orchestrated to appear as natural development rather than external influence. The Primarchs who turned against the Emperor genuinely believed that they were acting on insights and conclusions they had reached independently. The philosophical arguments that convinced them to reject imperial doctrine seemed logical and compelling based on their own experiences and observations. The emotional appeals that turned their love into hatred felt authentic and justified given the treatment they had received. The moment of open rebellion came not through coordinated planning but through a cascade of events that made continued loyalty impossible to maintain. The virus bombing of Istvan III was presented to the loyal elements of the traitor legions as a necessary military action against a particularly dangerous form of daemon corruption. Only when the weapons detonated and began consuming loyal Space Marines along with their enemies did the full scope of the betrayal become apparent. The choice to target loyal elements of their own legions first was strategically brilliant and psychologically devastating. It eliminated potential internal opposition while demonstrating to wavering personnel that the rebellion was irreversible. Space Marines who might have been willing to follow their Primarchs in opposing the Emperor found themselves facing brother warriors they had served alongside for decades, creating emotional trauma that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. The use of virus weapons added another layer of horror to the betrayal, as these banned armaments represented everything that Imperial doctrine claimed to reject. The slow, agonizing death they inflicted on their victims violated every principle of honorable warfare that the Space Marines had been taught to uphold. Their deployment against loyal Imperial forces demonstrated that the traitor Primarchs had abandoned not just their loyalty to the Emperor, but their commitment to the values that had made the Great Crusade a force for human unity and advancement. The psychological impact of the betrayal extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. Imperial personnel throughout the galaxy suddenly found themselves questioning the loyalty of colleagues they had trusted implicitly, wondering whether familiar faces might conceal hidden allegiances to powers they had never suspected existed. The bonds of brotherhood and shared purpose that had sustained Imperial forces through 2 centuries of expansion were shattered in a matter of hours, replaced by paranoia and suspicion that would poison relationships for generations to come. Communications networks that had been designed to coordinate Imperial operations became instruments of subversion, as traitor forces used established channels to spread confusion and disinformation. Loyal commanders found themselves isolated and uncertain, unsure whether orders received through official channels represented legitimate Imperial policy or attempts at manipulation by enemies who had infiltrated the highest levels of the command structure. The speed with which the rebellion spread revealed the extent to which chaos corruption had penetrated Imperial institutions. Personnel who had seemed completely loyal revealed themselves as long-term traitors who had been waiting for orders to act. Units that had served with distinction for decades turned against their former comrades with enthusiasm that suggested their betrayal had been planned rather than spontaneous. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that many of those who joined the rebellion genuinely believed they were acting in humanity's best interests. The philosophical arguments that had converted them to chaos worship provided compelling explanations for the contradictions and failures they had observed in Imperial policy. Their betrayal was not motivated by simple ambition or resentment, but by sincere conviction that the Emperor's vision for humanity's future was fundamentally flawed and needed to be replaced by something better. The revelation that half of the Primarchs and their legions had turned traitor represented more than just military disaster. It was the complete collapse of the philosophical and emotional foundations on which the Great Crusade had been built. The idea that genetically perfect beings created by the Emperor himself could be corrupted suggested that no one could be trusted absolutely. that the forces opposing humanity were more subtle and powerful than anyone had imagined. As word of the betrayal spread throughout Imperial space, the carefully constructed unity that had sustained 2 centuries of expansion began to crumble. Worlds that had accepted Imperial rule began reconsidering their loyalties. Military units that had operated effectively as integrated forces found themselves split along factional lines that hadn't existed days earlier. The administrative systems that had managed the greatest empire in galactic history proved inadequate for dealing with civil war on a scale that encompassed millions of worlds. The Great Crusade, humanity's greatest achievement, had become its most catastrophic failure. The very qualities that had made the Emperor's sons so effective as military commanders, their independence, their charisma, and their ability to inspire absolute loyalty, had also made them capable of inflicting damage that no external enemy could have achieved. The betrayal was complete, not just in its scope, but in its implications for everything the Imperium claimed to represent. The galaxy would never recover from what had been lost in those terrible days when brother fought brother and the dream of human unity died in the fires of civil war that would consume countless worlds and billions of lives. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just the political future of human space, but the survival of the species itself. The fabric of Imperial civilization began to unravel with a speed that caught even the most pessimistic strategists unprepared for the scope of the disaster. What had taken 2 centuries to build was being destroyed in months, as the carefully interwoven systems of communication, supply, and command that held the galaxy-spanning empire together collapsed under the weight of civil war. The betrayal at Istain the Theed had been more than just a military defeat. It was the introduction of a virus of doubt and suspicion that spread through Imperial space faster than any physical contagion. Communication networks that had been the nervous system of Imperial coordination became instruments of chaos and confusion. Astropathic messages that should have carried orders and intelligence instead brought reports of betrayal, conflicting loyalties, and desperate pleas for assistance from isolated commanders who no longer knew whom they could trust. The psychic screams of dying astropaths, murdered by traitor infiltrators, or driven insane by the psychic backlash of daemon manifestations, created gaps in the communication grid that left entire sectors operating in complete isolation. The loss of reliable intelligence transformed every decision into a gamble with potentially catastrophic consequences. Loyal commanders found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty, unable to determine whether reports of nearby Imperial forces represented potential allies or enemies masquerading as loyalists. Supply convoys that had operated safely for decades suddenly became targets for ambush by units that had served alongside them just weeks earlier. The fog of war had descended across the galaxy, but unlike conventional military confusion, this uncertainty extended to fundamental questions of identity and allegiance. Administrative systems that had managed the integration and governance of millions of worlds proved completely inadequate for dealing with the complexities of galactic civil war. The bureaucratic apparatus that had been optimized for coordinating expansion and development had no procedures for determining which personnel remained loyal and which had been corrupted by chaos influence. Routine administrative functions became impossible when clerks and administrators could no longer trust their colleagues or their superiors. The economic implications were equally devastating. Trade networks that had created unprecedented prosperity throughout human space were severed as merchants and shipping companies found themselves unable to determine safe routes or reliable trading partners. Worlds that had specialized in producing specific goods for galactic markets suddenly found themselves cut off from both suppliers and customers, forcing rapid and often unsuccessful attempts at economic self-sufficiency. Manufacturing capacity that had been carefully distributed across the empire to maximize efficiency and minimize vulnerability became a strategic nightmare as facilities fell under traitor control or were destroyed to prevent their capture. Forge worlds that had been producing weapons and equipment for loyalist forces suddenly found themselves besieged by former allies seeking to deny their production to Imperial defenders. The sophisticated supply chains that had sustained Imperial military operations began to fracture as key nodes fell to enemy action, or simply disappeared behind communication blackouts. The psychological impact on civilian populations was profound and far-reaching. Citizens who had lived their entire lives under the protection of the Great Crusades, seemingly invincible legions, suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that their defenders might have become their enemies. Planets that had welcomed imperial rule as liberation from isolation and barbarism began to question whether they had simply traded one form of oppression for another. Planetary governors faced impossible choices as conflicting orders arrived from different sources, each claiming legitimate imperial authority. Some attempted to maintain neutrality, hoping to avoid involvement in what they hoped would be a brief civil war. Others declared for whichever faction seemed most likely to provide protection for their populations. Many simply stopped acknowledging any external authority, effectively seceding from the Imperium they could no longer trust to protect their interests. The Space Marine legions that remained loyal to the Emperor found themselves fighting a war unlike anything they had been trained to conduct. Their doctrine and equipment had been optimized for conquest and expansion, operations that assumed clear objectives and identifiable enemies. Civil war required different skills entirely, involving complex judgments about loyalty and treachery that their superhuman capabilities were poorly suited to address. Worse still, the enemy they faced was intimately familiar with Imperial tactics, equipment, and personnel. Traitor forces didn't need to guess at Imperial defensive positions or wonder about reinforcement schedules because they had helped develop the plans they were now attacking. The advantage of surprise and superior intelligence that Imperial forces had enjoyed against Xenos enemies was completely reversed in a conflict where both sides possessed identical capabilities and training. The horror of fighting former brothers-in-arms created psychological trauma that affected even the transhuman Space Marines. Warriors who had shared decades of campaigning, who had saved each other's lives countless times, who had celebrated victories and mourned defeats together, suddenly found themselves trying to kill each other with the same ruthless efficiency they had once applied to humanity's enemies. The bonds of loyalty and affection that had made the Space Marine legions so effective became sources of anguish and confusion that undermined combat effectiveness. Regional variations in the conflict reflected the diverse character of Imperial space that had been one of the Great Crusade's greatest achievements. Areas with strong cultural traditions and established local leadership often proved more resilient than regions that had been heavily dependent on Imperial administration for governance and security. Worlds that had maintained some degree of self-sufficiency were better able to survive the collapse of galactic trade networks than those that had specialized in producing goods for empire-wide distribution. Some sectors managed to maintain local stability by forming defensive alliances that ignored the larger civil war entirely. These improvised federations focused on mutual protection and resource sharing, rather than choosing sides in a conflict they couldn't understand or control. While this approach preserved civilian populations and maintained some semblance of order, it also represented the effective dissolution of imperial unity in those regions. Military units that had been integrated across cultural and planetary lines found themselves torn apart by conflicting loyalties that had nothing to do with the larger philosophical issues driving the Civil War. Soldiers who had served loyally for years discovered that their officers, their comrades, or even their own family members had declared for the opposing side. The result was a fragmentation of imperial military power that multiplied the damage caused by outright betrayal. The logistical challenges of conducting operations across such vast distances while under constant threat of infiltration and sabotage proved nearly insurmountable. Supply lines that stretched across multiple star systems became impossible to secure when any imperial installation might have been compromised by traitor infiltrators. Even routine maintenance and resupply operations required security precautions that consumed resources and personnel at unsustainable rates. Navigation became increasingly dangerous as traitor forces began using their knowledge of imperial fleet movements to establish ambushes along traditional shipping routes. The predictable patterns that had made galactic commerce possible suddenly became vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Merchant vessels and military transports were forced to use longer, more dangerous routes that avoided areas of known traitor activity, further straining the logistics networks that kept loyal forces operational. The Daemon threat that had been manageable when Imperial forces could coordinate their responses became exponentially more dangerous in the chaos of civil war. Traitor forces actively encouraged Daemon manifestations as weapons against their loyalist opponents, while simultaneously spreading corruption that made it difficult for Imperial defenders to distinguish between natural warp phenomena and deliberate enemy action. Worlds that had been successfully purged of Daemon influence found themselves reinfected as local security forces were redeployed to deal with more immediate military threats. Intelligence networks that had taken decades to establish were compromised or destroyed within months, as agents found themselves cut off from their handlers or discovered that their contacts had changed sides. Personnel replacement and reinforcement, always challenging across galactic distances, became virtually impossible as training facilities fell under enemy control or were destroyed to prevent their capture. Experienced officers and technical specialists who had been killed or corrupted could not be replaced quickly enough to maintain operational effectiveness. Units that had operated at peak efficiency for decades found themselves struggling with personnel shortages and declining capability as attrition took its toll. The speed of the collapse surprised even those who had planned and orchestrated the betrayal. The traitor Primarchs had expected resistance, but they had underestimated how quickly the loss of central coordination would degrade Imperial capabilities throughout the galaxy. What they had intended as a surgical strike against Imperial leadership had triggered a cascade failure that was destroying the very civilization they claimed to be trying to improve. Perhaps most tragically, Much of the destruction was self-inflicted, as Imperial forces, unable to distinguish between loyal and traitor units, began treating all unknown contacts as potential enemies. The paranoia and suspicion that were necessary for survival in the new reality made cooperation between different Imperial factions almost impossible, even when they shared common objectives and faced common enemies. The Great Crusade's greatest achievement, the creation of a unified human civilization spanning the galaxy, had become its greatest vulnerability. The systems and relationships that had enabled unprecedented cooperation and coordination during the expansion were now being exploited by enemies who understood them intimately. Every strength had become a weakness, every asset had become a liability, and every connection had become a potential avenue for corruption and betrayal. As the Civil War entered its most destructive phase, it became clear that regardless of which side ultimately achieved victory, the galaxy would never again see anything resembling the unity and prosperity that had characterized the Great Crusade's golden age. Too much had been lost, too many bonds had been broken, and too much blood had been spilled for any reconciliation to be possible. The dream of human dominion among the stars was dying in the flames of brother fighting brother, and from its ashes would emerge a darker, more desperate version of human civilization that would struggle for survival rather than strive for greatness. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, echoes of the Great Crusade continue to reverberate through Imperial space with a persistence that defies the passage of 10,000 years. Archaeological expeditions in the galaxy's most remote regions still occasionally discover lost worlds whose populations have maintained fragments of Great Crusade-era culture, preserved like insects in amber, while the rest of human civilization evolved along darker paths. These discoveries serve as painful reminders of what humanity achieved during its brief golden age, when unity and hope seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The most significant of these rediscoveries has been the gradual return of the Primarchs themselves, gene fathers who vanished during the heresy's aftermath, but whose genetic legacy continues to shape the Space Marine chapters that revere their memory. Rabaut Guilliman's resurrection by ancient Eldar technology represents more than just the return of a legendary military commander. It symbolizes the possibility that the Great Crusade's vision might still be achievable despite 10 millennia of decline and degradation. Guilliman's reaction to the Imperium he has inherited reveals the true scope of what was lost when the Great Crusade collapsed into civil war. The rational administrator who once governed Ultramar as a model of efficiency and prosperity has awakened to find his father's empire transformed into a theocratic nightmare, where ignorance and superstition have replaced knowledge and reason as the foundations of human civilization. The shock of this discovery has been visible to everyone who has witnessed his attempts to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy that has grown up around the Emperor's throne. Yet his presence has also demonstrated that the capabilities that made the Great Crusade possible have not been entirely lost, merely suppressed by institutional structures designed to prevent another civil war. The indomitous crusade that followed his return achieved results that had not been seen since the dark days immediately following the heresy, proving that Imperial forces remain capable of large-scale coordinated operations when provided with competent leadership and clear objectives. The possibility that other loyalist Primarchs might also return has created expectations and anxieties throughout imperial space that reflect the complex relationship between past glory and present limitations. Populations that have endured 10,000 years of decline and warfare cling to legends of the Gene Fathers as potential saviors who might restore the prosperity and security that their ancestors enjoyed during the Great Crusade's peak years. Yet imperial authorities remain deeply concerned about the political and social disruption that such returns might create, given the profound changes that have occurred in their absence. These concerns are not merely theoretical, as recent archaeological evidence suggests that several Primarchs may have survived the heresy in ways that imperial records do not document. Fragmentary reports from expeditionary fleets operating beyond the galaxy's eastern fringe describe encounters with human populations led by beings whose capabilities exceed normal parameters, while deep space monitoring stations have detected energy signatures consistent with technologies that have not been used since the Great Crusade era. The implications of such discoveries extend far beyond their immediate military significance, as they raise fundamental questions about the nature of imperial doctrine and the accuracy of the historical narratives that have sustained imperial culture for 10 millennia. If the official accounts of Primarch fates are incorrect, what other aspects of imperial orthodoxy might be based on incomplete or deliberately falsified information? The potential for such revelations to destabilize the ideological foundations of imperial civilization has made this one of the most sensitive areas of current imperial policy. Modern imperial expansion efforts continue to follow patterns established during the Great Crusade, but their limited scope and modest objectives highlight how dramatically imperial capabilities have declined since that earlier era. The Macharian Crusade, the most successful expansion campaign in recent imperial history, conquered 1,000 worlds over 7 years of warfare, an achievement that would have represented perhaps a month's work for a single expeditionary fleet during the Great Crusade's peak years. Yet even these limited successes demonstrate that the institutional knowledge and tactical doctrines developed during the Great Crusade remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The principles of combined arms warfare, multi-system coordination, and cultural integration that enabled the original expansion continue to provide frameworks for modern imperial strategy, even when applied on much smaller scales with far more modest resources. The technology recovery programs that have become increasingly important to imperial survival represent desperate attempts to recreate capabilities that were routine during the Great Crusade era. Every STC fragment recovered from ancient ruins, every intact weapon system salvaged from derelict ships, every functioning piece of Dark Age technology represents knowledge that was once common throughout human space, but has since been lost to warfare, neglect, or deliberate suppression. These recovery efforts have occasionally achieved spectacular successes that provide tantalizing glimpses of what human civilization once accomplished. The rediscovery of complete STC systems for advanced manufacturing processes has enabled the establishment of new forge worlds capable of producing equipment that approaches Great Crusade standards. The recovery of intact navigation databases has opened previously inaccessible regions of space to imperial exploration and exploitation. But perhaps more significantly, these discoveries have begun to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions that have shaped imperial policy for 10,000 years. Archaeological evidence, increasingly suggests that the relationship between the Emperor and the Chaos powers during the Great Crusade was far more complex than official doctrine acknowledges, with implications that extend to current imperial strategy for dealing with daemon threats and warp phenomena. Recent xeno-archaeological studies of worlds that were brought into compliance during the Great Crusade have revealed evidence of cooperation between imperial forces and Xenos populations that directly contradicts the absolute xenophobia that has characterized imperial policy since the Heresy. These discoveries suggest that the Emperor's original vision may have included provisions for limited cooperation with non-human species under specific circumstances, raising questions about whether current imperial doctrine represents genuine adherence to the Emperor's will or deviation from his actual intentions. The political implications of such revelations are staggering, as they challenge not just specific policies, but the entire ideological framework that has justified imperial actions for 10 millennia. If the Emperor originally intended for humanity to coexist with certain xenospecies rather than exterminate them entirely, then much of imperial military activity over the past 10,000 years might have been not just strategically counterproductive, but morally wrong, according to the Emperor's actual values. Similar questions have emerged regarding the imperial attitude toward technological innovation and scientific research. Archaeological evidence from Great Crusade-era facilities suggests that the Emperor actively encouraged experimentation and advancement in ways that directly contradict the technological conservatism that has characterized imperial culture since the Heresy. The possibility that current imperial doctrine represents deviation from rather than adherence to the Emperor's vision has created theological crises for institutions whose authority depends on their claim to be implementing his will. The ongoing threat posed by the traitor legions serves as a constant reminder of the Great Crusade's ultimate failure, but it also demonstrates the persistence of capabilities that were developed during that earlier era. The Black Crusades, launched from the Eye of Terror, continue to employ tactics and strategies that were developed during the Heresy itself, suggesting that the traitor forces have preserved institutional knowledge and technological capabilities that have been lost to their loyalist counterparts. This technological gap has become increasingly apparent as imperial forces struggle to counter threats that employ weapons and equipment that exceed current imperial manufacturing capabilities. The ease with which Chaos Space Marines can penetrate imperial defenses and the effectiveness of their assault tactics against modern imperial positions reflect not just their enhanced capabilities, but their access to technologies that the Imperium can no longer produce or maintain effectively. The psychological impact of these ongoing conflicts extends beyond their immediate military consequences, as they force imperial citizens to confront the uncomfortable reality that their enemies were once humanity's greatest champions. The traitor legions represent not external threats that can be dismissed as alien corruption, but internal failures that reflect flaws in the very foundations of imperial civilization. Yet these conflicts also demonstrate the enduring relevance of the values and principles that inspired the Great Crusade's original vision. The loyalty and sacrifice displayed by imperial forces in defense of worlds and populations they have never seen reflects the same spirit that sustained the Great Crusade through 2 centuries of expansion. The willingness to endure any hardship in service of a greater cause remains as strong in the 41st millennium as it was during humanity's golden age. The role of the Space Marine chapters in preserving Great Crusade traditions has become increasingly important, as other imperial institutions have abandoned or forgotten the cultural elements that once defined human civilization. Each chapter maintains its own interpretation of the Great Crusade's legacy, creating a diversity of perspectives that collectively preserve knowledge and values that might otherwise have been lost entirely. But this preservation comes at the cost of evolution and adaptation, as the reverence for Great Crusade-era achievements has discouraged innovation that might address contemporary challenges more effectively. The tension between honoring the past and adapting to present realities remains one of the fundamental challenges facing imperial civilization in its current form. The Emperor's continuing presence on the Golden Throne serves as the ultimate symbol of both the Great Crusade's achievement and its ultimate failure. His sacrifice to preserve humanity's survival represents the logical culmination of the vision that inspired the original expansion, yet his current state demonstrates how far that vision has been compromised by the realities of 10,000 years of warfare and decline. Recent developments in imperial technology have raised questions about whether the Emperor's condition might be reversible, whether the being who launched humanity's greatest expansion might somehow be restored to active leadership. The implications of such a possibility extend far beyond their immediate practical consequences, as they touch on fundamental questions about the nature of imperial civilization and its relationship to the vision that originally inspired it. The Great Crusade's ultimate legacy lies not in the territories it conquered or the enemies it defeated, but in its demonstration that humanity possesses the capacity for greatness that transcends the limitations of individual existence. The vision of unity, progress, and cosmic destiny that inspired that great endeavor continues to influence imperial policy and culture, even when its practical achievement seems impossible given current circumstances. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the memory of a time when there was hope for something better serves as both inspiration and reproach. The Great Crusade represents what humanity achieved when it dared to dream of greatness, and its failure serves as a warning of what happens when such dreams are corrupted by the very ambitions that make them possible. Yet the fact that the Imperium endures, that humanity continues to survive and occasionally even thrive, despite 10,000 years of seemingly impossible challenges, suggests that the spirit which made the Great Crusade possible remains unbroken. The dream of human unity among the stars may seem more distant than ever, but it has not been abandoned entirely. In the darkest hours, when hope seems foolish and survival appears impossible, the memory of what was once achieved continues to inspire acts of heroism and sacrifice that preserve the possibility that such greatness might someday be achieved again. The Great Crusade is over, but its story continues to unfold in every battle fought for the survival of human civilization, in every world defended against impossible odds, in every act of courage that preserves hope for a better future. The galaxy may be darker than the Emperor envisioned, but it remains illuminated by the light of human determination that no enemy has yet found a way to extinguish completely.